Chapter 1. Surviving Winter in the Dark Ages. No heat, no hope. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly cozy in a grim, historically accurate sort of way. So, dim the lights, settle under the blanket, and maybe pour yourself a cup of something warm, because we're traveling back to a time when cozy didn't really exist. The Dark Ages, where warmth was a luxury, food was a rumor, and if you survived the winter, congratulations, you got to do it all again next year. So, let's gently slip into the freezing fog of early medieval Britain and Northern Europe, where the concept of central heating was just fire. One single, smoky fire. Picture this. It's about the year 500 CE. The Roman Empire has collapsed, like really collapsed. The roads are crumbling, trade has withered, and whatever infrastructure once made life bearable is now being slowly reclaimed by mud and moss. And you, an ordinary person, are sitting inside what might generously be called a house. It's made of wattle and daub, which sounds quaint, but really just means sticks covered in mud. The wind howls through the cracks. The smoke from your central fire fills the room because there's no chimney, just a hole in the roof that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. If you're lucky, you're wearing wool. If you're not, well, you're just wearing cold. Now, the word winter back then wasn't a season. It was an endurance test. A months-long battle against hunger, dampness, and despair. Because when the harvest failed, people didn't eat locally. They starved locally. Food preservation was the name of the game. Salting, drying, smoking, anything to stretch the autumn bounty into spring. But salt was expensive, and smoking meant firewood, which meant time, labor, and trees. And in most of early medieval Europe, trees were either sacred, owned by someone else, or just wet. So, people improvised. Grains were boiled into thick porridge that could be eaten, cooled, and reb-oiled for days. Meat, when there was any, was often rancid. And nobody wasted anything. Bones became broth. Broth became sludge. And that sludge? Breakfast. Now imagine the nights. The sun set early, and there were no candles for the poor. Maybe a rushlight, which is a fancy way of saying a piece of grass dipped in animal fat that burned for about as long as your patience. So families gathered around the fire, wrapped in whatever rags they had, and just existed. Talking, singing softly, or praying that the thatch roof didn't catch fire from an errant spark. Because that was the other joy of medieval heating. Half the time you froze, and the other half you burned down your own house. Let's float over to Scandinavia, where winter wasn't just cold. It was basically the defining feature of existence. The Norse people were experts at pretending to be fine with it. They built long houses, low, thick-walled buildings where people and livestock shared space. Because nothing says warmth like sleeping next to a mildly judgmental cow. The smell, of course, was legendary. Ammonia, smoke, and unwashed humanity. But hey, at least it was body heat. Inside these longhouses, fires burned in central hearths all day and all night. The smoke would rise to the rafters, blackening the timbers over time, and, fun fact, that soot layer actually preserved the wood. So in a way, it was self-sustaining. Like nature's air purifier, if your idea of clean air was breathing a campfire for 8 hours straight. Over in Britain, people were still adjusting to post-Roman life. The villas, baths, and underfloor heating systems the Romans had left behind were basically ancient magic now. No one really understood them, and most had fallen into ruin. Peasants lived in one-room huts. Lords and chieftains had bigger huts. And kings? They just had multiple smoky rooms. The difference between a peasant's home and a royal hall wasn't insulation. It was how many fires you could afford to waste wood on. Speaking of wood, it was everything. You needed it for warmth, cooking, light, and tools. But in winter, good dry firewood was almost impossible to find. People would collect it all year long, stacking it to dry in whatever sunlight existed. If you ran out before spring, that was that. You didn't go buy more. You just sat in the dark and hoped your neighbors were generous. Spoiler, They usually weren't. The elite sometimes had charcoal, which burned cleaner and hotter. But even that came with risks. Carbon monoxide poisoning was a real, if misunderstood, killer. Imagine waking up feeling dizzy and weak, assuming it was the cold, and just never waking up again. The Dark Ages didn't get their name from metaphor alone. Let's wander for a moment to the monasteries, those rare islands of organization and warmth. Monks had a routine that kept them moving. Prayers, work, reading. The buildings were stone, the walls thick, and the fires few. They'd gather in a single heated room called the Kale Factory, basically the medieval version of a break room, where they could briefly thaw their fingers before copying more manuscripts. Many scribes wrote about their ink freezing mid-script. Imagine trying to illuminate a manuscript while your hands are shaking so hard you can barely hold the quill. Some added little complaints in the margins, my personal favorite being one that reads, "It is very cold today. My fingers ache." Relatable. Let's glide over now to continental Europe, the Frankish kingdoms, early medieval France, Germany, and beyond. Winters there were just as bleak. People huddled in their timber-framed homes, trying to stretch dwindling food stores. Bread, if you had it, was dense and sour, more like compressed sadness than food. Sometimes it was mixed with ground acorns or tree bark to make it last longer. And yes, that's where we get the phrase bark bread. It was exactly what it sounds like. But here's the thing, people didn't complain much. They couldn't. Complaining didn't generate heat. They accepted that life was cyclical. Winter was misery, spring was relief, summer was labor, autumn was anxiety. Then back to misery again. And within that loop, survival itself became a kind of quiet victory. Even the animals struggled. Cattle were often slaughtered before winter simply because there wasn't enough fodder to keep them alive. People would preserve the meat as best they could, smoking it, drying it, or packing it in salt if they had the means. The rest? It spoiled. Quickly. By February, most people were living on thin gruel, moldy bread, and whatever roots they could dig out of the frost. And when you consider that famine and malnutrition weakened immune systems, it's no wonder medieval winters were basically open season for disease. Let's not forget, this was also the age before proper insulation, before glass windows, before the idea that indoors was a separate world from outside. In many homes, the line between the two was negotiable. Drafts whistled through every gap, and snow sometimes blew right in. The floor was dirt. If you dropped something, it was gone, lost to the mud gods. The fire wasn't just for warmth. It was your stove, your light, your gathering place, and occasionally your hazard. Now, among the elite, kings, nobles, bishops, things were technically better. They had servants, food stores, furs, and stone halls. But better is relative. A drafty stone castle without modern heating is basically an expensive refrigerator. Many castles had enormous fireplaces, the kind you could practically walk into. But they were terribly inefficient. Heat rose straight out the chimney, leaving the rest of the room icy. Guests often dined in cloaks and gloves, sitting inches from the fire while their backs froze solid. And the smoke? Oh, constant. Medieval heating meant living in a state of permanent fog. So when we see romantic images of torchlit banquets and roaring fires, just imagine everyone coughing politely between bites. By late winter, the psychological toll was immense. The days were gray, the nights long, and the hope for spring felt theoretical. Many historians think seasonal depression was widespread, even if no one had words for it. They called it the winter sickness or melancholia. And honestly, fair enough. But when the first green shoots appeared in March, that relief must have been indescribable. Like seeing color for the first time in months. The people who survived, and many didn't, emerged gaunt but alive. The first fresh milk, eggs, and greens must have felt like small miracles. But before we move to the next grim century, let's pause here in this quiet medieval night. A smoky fire flickers in the corner. Someone hums a song older than memory. The wind presses against the walls, whispering of snow. And in this fragile stillness, humanity endures, barely, stubbornly, and always, somehow, with hope. Chapter 2. The nobles who pretended to be warm. If the peasants suffered through winter, the nobles performed through it. They weren't immune to the cold, far from it. But wealth let them pretend the misery was fashionable. Because when you've got a dozen servants freezing on your behalf, it somehow feels classier. In the early medieval courts of Europe, warmth wasn't comfort, it was status. Having a big fire didn't just heat the hall, it showed off how much you could afford to waste. A nobleman's hearth might burn through entire forests over the course of a winter. Convenient if you owned the forest. Of course, this didn't mean their castles were actually warm. Stone, while impressive, is also an excellent conductor of cold. So even as massive fires roared day and night, the heat never quite made it past the few feet in front of the flames. That's why tapestries weren't just decoration, they were medieval insulation. Heavy wool hangings draped along the walls to trap whatever heat they could. Some nobles even lined their ceilings with fabric too, creating what was basically the medieval version of thermal wallpaper. It didn't work perfectly, but at least it looked impressive while everyone shivered. Picture a medieval great hall, the social hub of any noble household. A high, smoky room filled with servants bustling around, dogs stealing scraps, and guests trying to look dignified while their teeth chattered. In the center, a massive open hearth. The flames danced, the smoke curled upward, and theoretically, it all escaped through a hole in the roof. In reality, much of it just swirled back into the room, turning every feast into a slow-smoked dinner experience. Still, it was better than the alternative. Nobles weren't stupid, they knew that fire meant life. So they built multiple hearths and fires in every major chamber they could. And they sat close. Very close. The phrase, "by the fireside," wasn't poetic, it was survivalist. Servants, naturally, fared worse. While the Lord's chair might be practically in the fire, the servants were stationed in doorways, corridors, and drafty corners. They were constantly opening and closing doors, letting in the icy air, and somehow expected to act like they didn't notice. Many nobles had the charming custom of banning servants from warming themselves at the hearth on the grounds that it spoiled their diligence. So, they froze with good posture. Let's float to France, where courtly fashion was more important than thermal logic. Layers were status symbols. The more you wore, the wealthier you appeared. Velvet, brocade, fur, and linen, stacked one over another until nobles resembled elaborately wrapped leftovers. Real fur was the ultimate flex. Ermine was a favorite, a pristine white fur with tiny black tips, famously used in royal robes. But since ermine was rare, lower nobles sometimes resorted to squirrel or rabbit, dyed white to imitate the real thing. So next time you see a medieval portrait dripping in ermine, there's a decent chance it's just rebranded rodent couture. Now, about beds, the one place where warmth actually mattered. Noble beds were enormous, elevated, and surrounded by curtains. Those heavy fabric drapes weren't just decorative, they created a microclimate. Close the curtains, pile on the furs, add a couple of hot stones under the sheets, and you could at least pretend it wasn't freezing outside. Of course, hot stones meant literally heating rocks in the fire, wrapping them in cloth, and slipping them under the covers. Too hot, and you'd scorch the linen. Too cool, and it wasn't worth the effort. A delicate science of medieval bed warming. Some castles even had bed warmers, shallow metal pans filled with embers and slid between the sheets. Servants did this moments before their masters went to bed. If the servant lingered too long, there was always the risk of fire or of being accused of warming oneself instead. One chronicler mentioned that the chambermaid was often scolded for taking comfort too long. You can practically hear the sarcasm in the ink. Food, of course, was the other comfort of winter. The elite didn't starve like peasants, but that didn't mean they ate well. Preserved meats, salted fish, dried fruit, all technically edible, but rarely fresh. Feasts were attempts to remind everyone that the host still had resources. Roasted boar, venison, spiced wine, all served lukewarm by the time they reached the table, because castles were designed for defense, not catering efficiency. And let's not forget the ever-present ale. Water was unsafe, and wine was expensive outside southern Europe. So everyone drank weak ale, all day, every day. Children, monks, nobles, everyone. By midwinter, most of Europe was lightly buzzed just to stay functional. It also probably helped numb the cold, so maybe that counts as innovation. Heating technology didn't improve much for centuries. Early castles relied entirely on open hearths. But by the 12th century, the miracle of the fireplace arrived, with an actual chimney. Suddenly, rooms could have smaller, controlled fires that didn't fill the place with smoke. Of course, only the rich could afford to retrofit their homes. So once again, warmth became a marker of class. If your home had a chimney, you were practically a modern innovator. If not, enjoy the lung damage. Superstition also shaped how nobles faced the cold. People genuinely believed that drafts carried illness. Not far off, but their solutions were creative. They hung herbs and amulets around doors, burned incense to purify the air, and avoided bathing in winter because it was thought to open the pores to evil vapors. So, yes, medieval nobles often spent months unwashed, sealed inside smoky stone boxes. Perfume and scented gloves became winter survival tools. The Middle Ages were fragrant, just not in the good way. Let's drift toward the courts of early medieval Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. Here, the nobility loved great halls, massive rectangular spaces designed for audiences, banquets, and the occasional political tantrum. In winter, the hearth was so large that servants could stand inside it to tend the fire. One chronicler described Emperor Henry II's hall as lit like the sun, though that probably meant mildly visible through the smoke. Even so, guests marveled at it, not for comfort, but for spectacle. Heat wasn't just a necessity. It was theater. Every log burned was a declaration of wealth. It said, "We can afford to turn our forest into ambience." Over in England, Norman lords took things further. Their castles featured huge fireplaces in the upper great chambers, often decorated with carved stone hoods and mantels. These were symbols of authority, literal hot seats. The lord sat closest to the fire, the lady beside him, and everyone else arranged by rank outward. By the time you reached the edge of the room, you were basically outdoors. There's a lovely medieval phrase, "cold as the king's favor." It probably started in a room like that. But even the mightiest monarchs weren't immune to drafts. Henry II of England once complained that his castles blew with more wind than the field. Meanwhile, in France, Louis IX, the future St. Louis, insisted on fasting and minimal fire use during Lent, which must have made his courtiers deeply regret their spiritual choices. The royals could afford warmth but often denied it out of piety or pride. Because if you weren't suffering, were you even medieval? One of the more unintentionally comedic inventions was the warming shoe, a metal or ceramic foot warmer filled with coals and placed under the table during meals. Great in theory, hazardous in practice. There are accounts of tablecloths catching fire mid-banquet and nobles calmly continuing dinner as servants stomped out the flames. The ultimate, just another Tuesday, energy. Let's not forget that luxury itself caused cold. Castles were built high, often on windy hills, with open courtyards and tall towers, all terrible design choices for winter survival. The same stone that made them impregnable also made them miserable. That's why so many nobles spent winter not in castles, but in smaller manor houses or hunting lodges. These were cozier, easier to heat, and conveniently removed from political responsibilities. Imagine being rich enough to just say, "Let's go somewhere less drafty for the season." A medieval vacation, but colder. And yet, beneath all the ceremony, the nobles still shared the same primal fear as everyone else, that winter might win. that a bad harvest, an early frost, or a long snow could undo everything. Even the richest stores could run out. Letters from noblewomen sometimes mention praying for mild weather, or sending servants to test the earth to see if planting time had come. For all their wealth, they were still just waiting on spring. By late winter, the luxury lost its luster. The fine clothes smelled of smoke, the food was repetitive, and tempers ran short. Cabin fever, medieval edition. There's a record of one nobleman who, after being snowed in for weeks, ordered his entire household to stage mock tournaments indoors just to pass the time. Predictably, someone broke a window, and he banned entertainment for the rest of the season. A perfect summary of aristocratic problem-solving. So, while peasants endured and monks prayed, the nobles pretended. They wrapped themselves in fur and delusion, hosted feasts beside smoky fires, and told themselves they were living grandly. But in the end, cold is the great equalizer. Everyone shivered. Only the upholstery changed. Chapter 3. The Monks Who Froze for God. Monks, unlike nobles, didn't pretend to be warm. They simply accepted they weren't, and called it holy. To live in a monastery during the Dark Ages was to enter a lifelong relationship with discomfort. Poverty, silence, and humility were virtues. Warmth? Suspiciously luxurious. If you were comfortable, you were probably sinning. Let's drift first to the early Benedictine communities of the 6th century, the blueprint for Western monastic life. Saint Benedict, in all his wisdom, wrote a rulebook for monks. It covered prayer schedules, diet, obedience, even when to speak. But it said very little about heating. Which makes sense. Benedict lived in Italy. He didn't account for what his northern followers would experience when they tried to follow the same rule in, say, Yorkshire. So, while southern monks prayed in mild Mediterranean breezes, their northern counterparts were busy freezing in drafty stone chapels, politely trying not to die of exposure. Daily life began before dawn. The first prayers, matins, started somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning. Imagine waking up in total darkness, scraping ice off your blanket, and trudging barefoot across a cold flagstone floor to the chapel. No fire, no candlelight except a few flickering lamps, and breath misting in the air. Silence was required, which is unfortunate because monks probably wanted to scream. But they endured it, because that was the point. Suffering purified the soul. Comfort corrupted it. So, they accepted the cold as a kind of spiritual cleansing, a baptism by frostbite. Clothing was simple: a tunic, a wool cowl, maybe a cloak if you were lucky. The rule of Saint Benedict specifically discouraged personal luxury, including fancy or multiple garments. So there was no winter wardrobe. You wore what you had and layered faith on top. Some monasteries eventually relaxed the rule, allowing thicker wool or fur-lined cloaks in winter. But even then, moderation was expected. Too much warmth was seen as vanity. There are stories of particularly zealous monks who deliberately avoided warming themselves, even when ill, insisting that God's love was warmth enough. It wasn't, but it made for excellent hagiography. The buildings themselves didn't help. Early monasteries were built for durability, not comfort: long, echoing stone corridors, bare chapels, high ceilings, and minimal decoration. The acoustics were heavenly. The temperature was subarctic. Most monasteries had one heated room, the kale factory. This was the designated warming chamber. A single hearth kept alight through winter. Monks could enter to thaw their fingers, usually after hours of labor or prayer. But there were strict limits. You couldn't just hang out there for fun. A 12th century rule from Cluny actually specified that monks could only visit the kale factory for as long as it took to warm their hands and feet. No lingering. Too much comfort was morally suspicious. The scriptorium, where monks copied manuscripts, was another cold battlefield. It wasn't heated, since open flames were a fire risk near parchment. So scribes sat wrapped in cloaks, writing by dim light, fingers stiff and ink half frozen. You can feel the misery in the margins. Literally. Medieval manuscripts are full of little notes like, "The parchment is stiff today. The ink is freezing. Oh, that it were summer." And my personal favorite, "Writing is excessive labor." Yes, it is. Still, this was the era when books were sacred, every page an act of devotion. Copying the Psalms while your nose dripped onto the parchment was practically a form of prayer. And if you made a mistake, you couldn't blame the cold. You just sighed, crossed yourself, and started again. One Irish monk in the 9th century doodled a cat in the corner of his manuscript and wrote beneath it, "Pangur Bon, my cat, helps me hunt for letters as he hunts for mice." That same cat was probably his only source of body heat. Meals weren't much warmer. Monks ate in silence, in vast stone refectories, often with windows open for air and humility. The food was simple: bread, pottage, maybe fish or beans. Meat was usually forbidden except for the sick. And of course, everything was cold by the time it reached the table. Imagine spooning up lukewarm lentil stew in a room colder than the outside air, surrounded by 50 silent men chewing contemplatively. If there was a sound, it was teeth chattering in unison, a kind of accidental Gregorian percussion. The dormitory, or dorter, was communal. No private cells, just rows of beds or straw pallets in a long hall. No heating, no curtains, no privacy. Monks slept fully clothed, often under thin wool blankets. The logic was that shared suffering built spiritual brotherhood. It probably also built pneumonia. But again, every discomfort was a gift to God. A warm bed was a worldly pleasure. A cold one? Heavenly discipline. Winter also changed the rhythm of monastic labor. Fields froze, gardens died, and outdoor work became impossible. So monks turned to indoor crafts: brewing, writing, weaving. Breweries, at least, had fire. Brewing ale was not only pious, since monks drank it as a safer alternative to water, but it also conveniently warmed the workroom. Many monks volunteered for brewing duty in winter. A curious coincidence. Meanwhile, the infirmary was the warmest place in the monastery, but you had to be legitimately dying to stay there. Even mild illness didn't guarantee access. A cough? Pray about it. A fever? Offer it up to God. Hypothermia? Congratulations, your soul is now closer to purity. There's a recorded case from the 11th century of a monk who fell asleep during prayer and nearly froze to death in the choir stalls. Instead of pity, his brothers praised his devotion for resisting sloth unto peril. Translation: falling asleep in church was suddenly holy if you almost died doing it. Let's float over to Ireland and Scotland, where monasticism thrived in truly brutal climates. The Celtic monks were built different. They sought isolation, often founding monasteries on wind-lashed coasts or remote islands where survival itself was a test of faith. Take the monastery of Skellig Michael, perched on a jagged rock off Ireland's coast. Small stone huts clung to the cliffs, with no fuel supply, little food, and constant Atlantic gales. The monks there lived on fish, seaweed, and prayer. Their daily schedule included climbing steep rock paths in icy wind just to chant the Psalms in tiny stone chapels. It sounds like a punishment. For them, it was paradise. They believed that hardship drew them closer to God, that to suffer cold, hunger, and solitude was to share in Christ's endurance. So when the waves froze and the wind cut like knives, they smiled. Probably through chattering teeth, but still smiled. Back on the continent, monasteries like Cluny and Monte Cassino were becoming grand and organized. They had stone cloisters, libraries, and even early heating innovations. Some clever monks figured out how to channel hot air from kitchen fires through wall flues, primitive central heating, centuries before it became normal. Of course, this was reserved for the abbot and guests. Everyone else could continue freezing in godly equality. Speaking of abbots, some of them developed reputations for extreme austerity. They deliberately rationed firewood or banned heating altogether. There's a charming anecdote about Abbot Hugh of Cluny, who reportedly rebuked a brother for warming his hands too long. The poor monk's crime? Thawing out after hours of outdoor labor. Moderation in all things, even in not freezing to death. But not every monastery was an icebox. Some were surprisingly pragmatic. Cistercian monks, known for their plain living, still understood that dead monks couldn't pray. So they designed clever layouts. Kitchens and workshops clustered together to share heat, cloisters angled to catch sunlight, dormitories built above storage rooms to benefit from rising warmth. It wasn't luxury, just efficiency, which, in monastic terms, bordered on genius. Still, winter brought spiritual danger, idleness. With long dark hours and little outdoor work, monks risked boredom, the enemy of piety. So abbots scheduled extra readings, longer vigils, and more fasting, because if you were hungry, cold, and exhausted, you had less time to sin. It's a very medieval solution. If the devil tempts idle hands, make sure those hands are too numb to move. As spring approached, the thaw was both a relief and a test. Frozen pipes burst, roofs leaked, walls cracked. Repair season began, another form of holy labor. And when the first green appeared, monks sang hymns of renewal, praising God for the return of warmth. But you can almost hear the subtext. Thank you, Lord, that we can finally feel our feet again. Monks endured winter with grace, but also with stubbornness. Their devotion turned deprivation into ritual. They didn't conquer the cold, they sanctified it. And in doing so, they left behind not just illuminated manuscripts and stone abbeys, but an unintentional legacy of endurance. Proof that humanity can find meaning in misery, and even holiness in hypothermia. Chapter 4. Peasant Winter, Mud, Misery, and Miracles. For every noble wrapped in furs or monk quietly suffering in stone halls, there was the average peasant. And by average, I mean someone whose life in winter was a daily negotiation with mud, cold, hunger, and the occasional rat. The peasant's home was, by modern standards, almost aggressively minimal. A single-room hut made of wattle and daub, with a roof of thatch or turf. No insulation, no chimney, no hope. Inside, the family huddled around a central hearth. Smoke filled the room, because venting it through a hole in the roof was considered optional or ignored entirely. The fire was the same fire for cooking, heating, and whatever light could be coaxed from flames. It was smoky, and occasionally terrifying. If you were small and unlucky, you slept against a wall near the door. It was drafty, cold, and sometimes wet from melting snow. If you were older or stronger, you got a slightly less miserable spot. Hierarchy still mattered, even in misery. Food was scarce, very scarce. Winter was basically an extended fast, punctuated by what peasants could scavenge or preserve from autumn. Grains were pounded into coarse flour, made into dense bread, and eaten with whatever vegetables had survived. Almost never. Occasionally, a pig or cow would be slaughtered in late autumn, but the meat had to last months. It was salted, smoked, and sliced thin. By February, it was mostly chewy leather with a faintly sour tang. Roots were often the saving grace: turnips, parsnips, leeks, and occasionally wild herbs. Some historians suggest peasants developed a taste for bitter vegetables out of necessity. Or perhaps that bitterness was the flavor of survival itself. Water was another challenge. Wells could freeze. Rivers ran icy. Snow could be melted, but that required fuel, always in short supply. Some peasants drank weak ale as a safer alternative. Children, adults, and sometimes livestock all sipped on it. A mild buzz was practically mandatory to face the cold with sanity intact. Hygiene was minimal. Bathing in winter? Rare. Ice-cold rivers or snow were considered cleansing, if you were brave enough. Soap existed in some areas, made from animal fat and ash, but in winter it was solid and uncooperative. The combination of smoke, damp, and rarely washed clothing created a uniquely medieval bouquet. Clothing was layered, patched, and rarely replaced. Wool was king, but cheap and thin. Everyone wore several layers, often ragged and mismatched. Children were wrapped in scraps of old garments, sometimes inherited from older siblings who had outgrown them. Boots were a luxury. Most people walked in straw sandals, wooden clogs, or bare feet. Feet froze. Hands froze. Faces turned red, then purple. Nose tips occasionally fell off, not dramatically, but enough to leave little cold casualties. Yet somehow, peasants endured. Winter work didn't vanish. There was firewood to collect, livestock to feed, fences to repair, roofs to maintain. Each task meant stepping into ice and mud, often up to the knees. Snow and frozen fields made the work slower and more punishing. Still, peasants found ways to persevere. They traded, bartered, and scavenged. They maintained small gardens indoors if possible, containers of soil warmed near the hearth. Every green sprout was a triumph. Every preserved vegetable a miracle. Animals were crucial, but they, too, struggled. Cattle, pigs, chickens, goats, all needed extra fodder. Peasants had stored hay and straw, but when supplies ran low, some animals were eaten early and others starved. If the sheep died, that was winter lost. Wool for warmth vanished. Milk for nourishment vanished. Every loss was painfully visible. Superstition and folklore flourished in winter. Frozen landscapes felt hostile, mysterious, and occasionally deadly. Peasants believed in winter spirits, mischievous frost demons, and the occasional ghost wandering the fields. They left food for these beings just in case, essentially medieval insurance policies. Talismans, charms, and small prayers were common. A sprig of holly, a smudge of soot over a doorway, or a whispered incantation might ward off illness or frostbite. Not scientifically effective, but psychologically essential. Communities stuck together. Villages often clustered huts close for warmth. Neighbors shared firewood, food, and news. If someone's roof collapsed under snow, the others pitched in. Winter was not just cold, it was a social test. Those who failed to help risked isolation, starvation, or worse. And sometimes the collective misfortune led to creativity. Snow was used for insulation under floors or walls. Mud mixed with straw reinforced doors. Some families buried root vegetables in the ground or under straw to keep them from freezing. Survival required ingenuity, patience, and stubbornness. Children were both resilient and vulnerable. They played in the snow when possible, learned to fetch firewood early, and helped with chores. Frostbite and illness were constant threats, yet playfulness endured. They learned endurance young, and the winters of their childhood often dictated their survival into adulthood. Celebrations, when they occurred, were precious. Christmas, Epiphany, or local saints' days provided short relief from monotony. Even minimal feasts, salted meat, preserved fruit, a little ale, were cause for gratitude. Songs were sung, stories told by fires that smoked and stung the eyes, and people laughed quietly through chattering teeth. Every small comfort mattered. Every tiny warmth was celebrated. It's easy to romanticize the medieval peasant, but winter was brutal, and the ability to survive it required grit and luck. Disease compounded misery. Malnutrition made peasants more susceptible to respiratory illnesses, fevers, and dysentery. Frostbite and hypothermia were slow killers, often underreported in chronicles. When epidemics struck, winter amplified the threat. By spring, those who survived winter and plague were remarkably hardy, or simply lucky. Travel was near impossible. Roads became rivers of mud, ice, or snow. Villagers rarely ventured far. Markets shrank. Trade stalled. Isolation became the default. And isolation, combined with cold, scarcity, and illness, created a pervasive sense of quiet desperation. Yet life went on. Children grew, crops were prepared for spring, livestock were tended, and families huddled through night after night. Resilience became a cultural constant, a requirement, really, for anyone living north of Rome. Even the lowliest peasants kept an eye on the aristocracy. Noble fires seemed impossibly warm, halls impossibly grand. There was envy, certainly, but also practical observation. What could they learn? How to store food? Preserve heat? Organize community labor? Some of the smarter peasants adopted minor innovations. Small stoves, insulated bedding, or layering techniques observed from the elite. Survival was a teacher. Winter was the test. By the end of February or early March, frost began to recede. Ice on rivers cracked. Snow softened. Fields returned from their frozen slumber. Peasants ventured farther for foraging. Water became accessible. Food supplies slowly improved. The sense of relief was profound. Every green sprout, every melting stream, every thawed loaf of bread was a tiny celebration. Winter had been survived, barely, painfully, and with a little magic of resilience. Yet history often forgets the peasant winter. Chronicles speak of kings, monks, and nobles, but the real endurance was elsewhere, in mud, straw, and shivering huts. And in the quiet humor of human persistence, laughing through misery, finding small joys, and telling stories around the smoke-filled hearth. Chapter 5. Winter's toll on the sick, the weak, and the royally doomed. Winter was democratic in one sense. It spared no one entirely. It did not care for rank, piety, or wealth. It simply tested endurance. And some failed spectacularly. Let's start gently with the sick. Medical understanding in the Dark Ages was, shall we say, rudimentary. Illness was often blamed on imbalances of the four humors, evil spirits, or divine displeasure. So when winter arrived, bringing cold, damp, and scarcity, the sick were at a distinct disadvantage. Castles and monasteries may have been warmer than peasant huts, but warmth did not cure fever, plague, or malnutrition. Physicians, if you could even call them that, often recommended treatments that would make you cringe today. Bloodletting, poultices of unknown composition, or simply rest and prayer. And sometimes they did nothing at all. The weak, children, the elderly, and those already malnourished were especially vulnerable. In peasant homes, the youngest often suffered frostbite or respiratory illnesses first. A thin wool tunic and straw-stuffed shoes were inadequate protection. Hypothermia set in quietly. People weakened over days or weeks, often unnoticed until too late. Chroniclers occasionally mention infants lost to the winter. The phrase is simple, understated, almost polite, but it meant death. Even nobles, with all their wealth and warmth, were not immune. Take King Edward II of England. He had thick furs, heated chambers, and servants tasked with keeping him warm. Yet he was chronically ill and often bedridden. Winter exacerbated his weakness. The cold crept into the joints, lungs, and bones, reminding everyone that even kings are fragile. Other royals fared worse. Empress Matilda, caught in a bitter 12th century winter, suffered both illness and isolation in her castle. Food stores were sometimes insufficient, and storms prevented travel or aid. Privilege could delay suffering, but it could not prevent it. Let's float over to Scandinavia, where winters were longer and harsher. Chroniclers report famine and widespread illness in towns and villages. Noble families sometimes relocated temporarily to less exposed holdings. But travel was dangerous. Roads were frozen or mud-choked, rivers iced over. Those who moved risked exposure, falls, and accidents. Winter amplified every vulnerability. Disease was relentless. Respiratory infections thrived in cold, damp, and smoky interiors. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and bronchitis claimed many quietly. Malnutrition weakened resistance, and exposure during storms or while tending livestock worsened outcomes. Even monasteries were not safe. A sick monk might linger in the dormitory, unable to warm himself sufficiently, while prayer and scripture could not revive failing health. Chroniclers sometimes note deaths without fanfare, a simple line in a ledger, "Brother so-and-so succumbed this winter." The brevity underscores a grim reality. Winter was quietly fatal. Royalty and elites faced unique challenges beyond cold and disease. Their winter lives were intertwined with politics, warfare, and dynastic anxieties. Travel in winter was risky, yet unavoidable for diplomacy, military campaigns, or estate management. Consider King Harald Hardrada of Norway. His winter campaigns were famously brutal. Soldiers, horses, and ships all suffered from frost, ice, and starvation. He survived, but many did not. The cold was as lethal as any sword. Even within castles, the vulnerable could die in luxury. Fires sometimes caused accidents. Roofs collapsed under snow. Food spoiled despite wealth. Winter turned indulgence into peril. Then there were the royally doomed, heirs and nobles whose fragile health could not withstand winter stress. Edward, the Black Prince's eldest son, never reached adulthood. Illness, exacerbated by harsh winters, robbed his family of an heir. In France, Charles VIII's fragile daughters spent winters in drafty chambers, surviving feasts and ceremonies while quietly succumbing to exposure-related illnesses. Royal chroniclers often gloss over these tragedies with polite euphemisms: fell ill and passed in God's grace. Behind the politeness was frostbite, hunger, or disease, a cold reality obscured by ceremony. Winter also amplified domestic mismanagement. Castles and manors required constant labor to maintain warmth. Servants sometimes failed, fires went out, roofs leaked, and stores spoiled. A minor lapse could have major consequences. Chroniclers occasionally report nobles dying not from battle or illness, but simply from exposure in a poorly managed hall. The rich could survive longer, but winter demanded vigilance at every level. Even indulgence had its limits. In rural areas, peasant mortality spiked. Famine coincided with cold, disease, and exhaustion. Some villages reported losing a quarter of their population in a single winter. Children and the elderly were disproportionately affected, but adults also succumbed quietly. Yet life persisted. Villages adapted. They built better storage, pooled resources, and developed coping strategies. Winter was an annual trial, relentless, impartial, and shaping communities' resilience over generations. Hospitals and care centers existed, but resources were minimal. Sick and elderly were often cared for by family. When a patient grew too weak to survive, hospice care as we know it did not exist. Death in winter was often silent, slow, and without ceremony. It was winter's quiet hand, closing lives without fanfare. Even for those who survived, winter left marks. Joints stiffened from cold. Illnesses lingered. Nutritional deficits had long-term effects. Chroniclers sometimes describe nobles limping, peasants thin and gaunt, monks pale and brittle, a subtle yet pervasive imprint of the season. Winter was a sculptor, carving endurance into every life it touched. Yet humanity persisted. Families celebrated small victories. A week of fair weather, a successful hunt, a harvest preserved through clever storage. Communities adapted. Monks developed ingenious flue systems. Nobles hoarded wood and layered furs. Peasants patched walls and dug root cellars. Even as winter claimed the weakest and tested the strongest, people learned to endure. It was a slow, patient survival, not heroic, not dramatic, just persistent. By spring, those who remained emerged hardened, wary, and remarkably resilient. Every green shoot, every thawed stream, every recovered child felt miraculous. History often remembers wars, treaties, and coronations, but the quiet, grinding endurance of winter shaped lives, societies, and dynasties alike. Winter was a teacher, and its lessons were relentless. Respect scarcity, value warmth, nurture community, and never underestimate the cold. Chapter 6: Royal Winters, Privilege, Excess, and Icy Misfortune. Royal winters were a study in contrasts. Opulence met exposure, ceremony collided with frostbite, and every indulgence was tempered by the persistent, cold reality of the Dark Ages. Castles and palaces offered warmth in theory. Massive hearths, furs, and servants were designed to protect the elite from the biting chill. In practice? Not so much. Take Charles IV of France, a king famous for extravagance. He had luxurious robes, thick furs, and a household full of attendants. Yet he reportedly spent entire winter evenings shivering in his chambers because the wind whistled through poorly fitted doors and gaps in the stonework. Money could buy comfort, but not airtight construction. Even the most lavish halls were cold. Stone walls stored chill like a sponge. Fireplaces roared, but heat rarely radiated far. Courtiers learned quickly to cluster near flames, creating a patchwork of warmth that left anyone on the edges shivering politely. Furs were everywhere. Nobles draped themselves in sable, ermine, and mink. The more exotic, the better. Yet these garments had limits. Cold winds whipped around furs. Moisture seeped through layers. A perfectly tailored robe could still leave toes frostbitten. The irony was poetic. The wealthiest in the land could look resplendent while suffering quietly. One chronicler noted that Queen Isabeau of Bavaria sat wrapped in fox and sable, teeth chattering, yet laughed at courtly jokes as if warmed by humor alone. Food was another layer of winter defense. Massive feasts, spiced wines, and roast meats were designed to impress and sustain. Yet for all the indulgence, logistics failed. Snowstorms could block supply routes. Salted fish spoiled. Ale froze. Even kings occasionally stared at half-frozen pies and sighed. In England, Edward III's winter feasts sometimes featured food so cold that it required extra servants simply to reheat it. An extravagant inconvenience, but part of courtly life. Winter travel was a royal hazard. Diplomacy did not pause for frost or blizzards. Kings, queens, and heirs were expected to move between castles, territories, and hunting lodges, sometimes across frozen rivers or snow-laden passes. One anecdote describes a French princess traveling in a sleigh across a frozen river. The ice cracked beneath the runners, and attendants shouted. She reportedly stayed seated, composed, and elegant, because fainting or panicking would have been scandalous. The river did not respect elegance. Hunting, a winter pastime of the nobility, was another exercise in cold endurance. Deer, boar, and other quarry didn't wait for convenient weather. Noble hunting parties often bundled in furs, horses, and servants, chasing prey through snow, mud, and icy forests. Chroniclers occasionally describe kings returning home blue-lipped, exhausted, and ill. Yet the hunt was a statement of power. I can endure frost, and so can my dominion. Sometimes, the statement was literal. Frostbitten nobles were carried home, and courtiers quietly noted which heir looked weakest. Let's float to the Holy Roman Empire, where imperial winters could be severe. Castles perched on hilltops or along rivers offered stunning views, and wind tunnels. Emperors with the largest staffs of servants sometimes endured sub-zero chambers, drafts creeping under doors, and occasional roof leaks. Yet they maintained composure. Letters from this period often mention monarchs complaining about cold in subtle, ironic tones. "The chamber is quite bracing tonight," one emperor wrote. Translation, "It's freezing, and I wish someone would fix the door." Water supply added another layer of risk. Frozen wells meant that even royalty sometimes drank melted snow. Winter illnesses arose not from luxury, but from practical exposure. Even palace physicians, with their tinctures and poultices, could not guarantee warmth or survival. Pregnancy and childbirth were particularly perilous in winter. Queens often gave birth in drafty chambers, attended by midwives who themselves were cold and exhausted. Fires might burn in the room, but winter drafts found their way to the bed. Many royal infants succumbed to the cold despite every precaution. Winter was a silent participant in dynastic tragedy. Royal children were simultaneously indulged and exposed. They were swaddled in furs, but lessons, religious instruction, and ceremonial duties meant hours spent in freezing halls. Boys learning swordplay on icy grounds, girls rehearsing courtly manners beside unheated windows. The ideal of refinement often ignored the reality of frostbite. Some chroniclers remarked wryly that a young prince looked stiff as if carved from frozen wax. The child survived, but with winter's mark evident in posture, health, or temperament. Festivals in winter added irony. Christmas, Epiphany, and other celebrations meant extravagant food, music, and ceremony. Yet the cold could not be banished. Guests arrived in fur, often soaked from snow or sleet, and dined on food that had cooled in transit. Fireplaces offered localized warmth, but the halls remained cavernous and cold. Courtly etiquette demanded poise. Shivering, coughing, or grimacing was considered unseemly. Many nobles endured frostbite silently, choosing dignity over comfort. Even architecture could betray royalty. Towers, battlements, and long corridors allowed winds to circulate freely. Stone floors remained ice-cold, and drafts crept along poorly fitted doors. Fireplaces provided warmth only in limited areas. Courtiers learned to huddle near the hearth like migrating birds. Some kings commissioned multiple fireplaces, massive tapestries, or heated beds. Still, winter had a way of asserting its authority. A storm could make even the most luxurious palace a cold prison. Then there were accidents. Snow collapse, icy falls, or frozen streams claimed lives. The chronicles note nobles slipping from sleighs, horses losing footing, or roofs giving way under snow. Luxury did not equal safety. Even a king with 10 attendants could find himself at the mercy of frost. Finally, winter could exacerbate political misfortune. Illness, frostbite, or death at an opportune moment destabilized dynasties. Regencies were formed, heirs died, and succession crises arose, sometimes all due to winter's relentless pressure. Frost and snow, in their quiet way, shaped history as decisively as battle or treaty. Royal winters were therefore a paradox. Luxury provided tools to survive, yet the season's severity could humble the mighty. Privilege did not equal immunity, and opulence often clashed with the merciless cold. Yet, somehow, the nobility endured. Wrapped in furs, seated by fires, sipping spiced wine, they faced frost with dignity. And historians, centuries later, marvel at the quiet persistence of those icy, ceremonial trials. Winter was a ruler in its own right, impartial, unforgiving, and occasionally ironic. Chapter 7: Winter in the Markets and Streets. While nobles huddled in drafty halls and monks froze for piety, townsfolk faced a different kind of winter. Bustling streets turned into icy gauntlets, markets slowed by snow, and daily survival governed by mud, frost, and human ingenuity. Urban life in the Dark Ages was often precarious, even in fair weather. Winter made it downright miserable. Roads turned to treacherous mud or ice. Streets were narrow, poorly drained, and littered with refuse. Snow, once fallen, could compact into sheets of nearly invisible ice. A misstep could result in a fall, broken limb, or a splash of freezing slush. Merchants, laborers, and children all risked the hazards. Market life slowed but did not stop. Produce from surrounding villages had to be sold before freezing or spoiling. Vegetables, grains, salted fish, and dried meats were traded, often outdoors, in bitter cold. Sellers wrapped themselves in layered clothing, blankets, and sometimes straw padding to survive long hours exposed to the elements. Customers moved quickly, exchanging coins with chattering fingers. Coins were precious, cold, and sometimes frozen together. Handling them required nimble fingers or a small fire nearby to thaw them. Street vendors developed practical, if creative, winter strategies. Some built small windbreaks out of wood or canvas. Others placed coals in metal pans to warm hands or goods. Ice, while a hazard, also allowed for temporary refrigeration. Meat stayed fresher longer if kept outside. Yet exposure was relentless. Snowstorms, sleet, and icy winds spared no one. Even inns, the supposed sanctuary for weary travelers, were drafty and poorly insulated. Fireplaces were common but often small, accommodating only a few guests at a time. Crowding was unavoidable. Sanitation was worse than inconvenient. It was dangerous. Snow and frozen waste covered streets. Mud mixed with excrement became a sticky, frozen hazard. Dogs, pigs, and people all contributed to the winter slurry. Slip and fall accidents were common. Children and animals alike disappeared into the muck. Some towns developed rudimentary drainage, but only a few. Most people learned to navigate by intuition and stubbornness. Water supply in towns mirrored rural scarcity. Wells froze. Rivers were often the only option for drinking or washing. Fetching water required thick gloves, layered clothing, and endurance. Spilled buckets could freeze immediately, creating dangerous patches on already slick streets. Urban winters also brought disease. Cold and damp weakened resistance, while crowded living conditions allowed respiratory infections and fevers to spread rapidly. Smallpox, influenza, and dysentery were winter constants. Children were particularly vulnerable. Chroniclers note that mortality rates spiked during harsh winters in urban centers. Merchants relied on cooperation as much as skill. Caravans moved slowly, inns coordinated shelter for travelers, guilds monitored apprentices and workers. Bartering became common, sometimes in food, sometimes in firewood or clothing. Community survival mattered more than competition when frost threatened livelihoods. Winter festivities offered brief relief. Christmas markets, feast days, and religious celebrations provided warmth, both literal and social. People gathered around fires, sold spiced foods and ale, and exchanged stories. Noise, laughter, and music temporarily replaced the silence of frost-laden streets. Yet, even during celebrations, caution was paramount. Ice-coated bridges could be treacherous. Crowds slipped and fell. Snow-laden roofs sometimes collapsed. Urban life demanded constant attention. Survival was never guaranteed. Housing for commoners was modest. Timber-framed cottages, wattle-and-daub walls, thatched roofs, all were poorly insulated. Fires were small and primarily for cooking. Some families shared a single hearth among multiple rooms. Bedrooms were often just lofts above the main living area, where warmth rose slightly but never enough. Bedding consisted of straw, rough blankets, and occasionally animal skins. Children and elders were often wrapped together to conserve heat. Even indoors, frost crept along walls and floors, leaving a lingering chill. Clothing was layered and patched. Wool, linen, and scraps were combined into ensembles that prioritized warmth over fashion. Hats, gloves, and cloaks were essential. Feet were wrapped in straw, leather, or wool. Layering was a skill. Too little meant freezing, too much restricted movement while navigating icy streets. Urban work continued regardless of cold. Bakers stoked ovens, smiths hammered at forges, and carpenters built or repaired structures. Street laborers shoveled snow, repaired roads, and carried goods between frozen warehouses. Winter productivity was exhausting but necessary. Some towns experimented with rudimentary urban heating. Fires were placed in central squares. Blankets or screens provided shelter for outdoor work. Merchants and officials recognized that survival depended on cooperation and ingenuity, not just courage. Food scarcity was a constant challenge. Winter stores had to last until spring. Grain, salted meat, dried legumes, and preserved vegetables dominated diets. Baking and cooking required fuel, which was in short supply. Families rationed carefully, often supplementing with foraged roots or frozen fish. Urban winters also amplified social hierarchies. Wealthy merchants could afford heated rooms, furs, and private lodgings. Poor artisans and laborers huddled in shared spaces, struggling to survive the cold. Yet necessity fostered solidarity. Guilds organized communal aid. Neighbors shared food, clothing, and firewood. Animals in towns, like in villages, suffered alongside humans. Horses, pigs, and chickens required fodder and shelter. Stables offered warmth for the wealthier citizens, but poorer families often left animals exposed. Winter mortality among urban livestock could devastate families dependent on milk, eggs, or transport. As winter dragged on, the psychological toll accumulated. Short days, long nights, and pervasive cold led to fatigue, irritability, and despair. Humor, storytelling, and occasional celebrations offered relief, but exhaustion persisted. Even resilient citizens felt the weight of frost, scarcity, and uncertainty. Spring's arrival brought profound relief. Snow melted, roads reopened, rivers thawed, food became more abundant, merchants resumed trade. Streets buzzed with renewed energy. Survivors emerged hardened, wary, and wiser for having endured yet another winter. Urban winters in the Dark Ages were brutal, monotonous, and relentless. Yet life endured. Ingenuity, communal support, and stubborn perseverance allowed townsfolk to navigate icy streets, frozen markets, and smoky homes. Winter was a teacher, shaping daily life, urban infrastructure, and social bonds, quietly but decisively. Chapter 8: Winter Festivals and Folklore, Magic, Myths, and Miracles. Winter in the Dark Ages was long, harsh, and unpredictable. The cold wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a spiritual and cultural one as well. People looked for meaning in the frost, the snow, and the long, dark nights. And when meaning was scarce, they turned to magic, myth, and ritual. Festivals provided a welcome break from monotony and suffering. Christmas, Yule, Epiphany, and local saint days punctuated the frozen months. These occasions combined religious devotion, communal gathering, and practical survival. Feasts, when available, were modest but treasured, a temporary warmth in more ways than one. Winter folklore was abundant. Stories warned of spirits, frost demons, and wandering souls. People believed that cold winds were sometimes mischievous or malevolent. Leaving a window open or failing to leave offerings might invite misfortune. Superstition was both insurance and entertainment, practical enough when wood, food, and fire were scarce. Households practiced rituals to protect themselves. A sprig of holly above a doorway could ward off evil spirits. Charred bones placed near the hearth were thought to keep fires burning. Salt, ash, and blessed water appeared in many traditions, preserving both hearth and health. Children were instructed to respect winter spirits. Warnings against wandering alone, speaking to snow drifts, or mocking the frost were common. Obedience and caution were considered protection against both natural and supernatural dangers. Certain days were considered especially potent. The winter solstice marked the turning of the sun and was celebrated with candles, feasts, and small rituals. Villagers and nobles alike believed that light could push back the darkness, both literal and symbolic. Feasting, singing, and ritual dances offered community cohesion and psychological relief. Magic was practical as well as spiritual. Folk remedies for frostbite, illness, and hunger often combined herbal knowledge with superstition. Mint or sage might be burned to ward off disease. Eggshells, bones, or stones could be placed around the house to prevent misfortune. The cold created a heightened sense of vulnerability, and these rituals helped people feel some measure of control. Winter also inspired storytelling. Tales of spectral wolves, ghostly travelers, and frozen lakes that swallowed unsuspecting wanderers circulated widely. These stories served dual purposes: entertainment and caution. Parents told them to encourage children to stay near hearths, and villagers repeated them to make sense of inexplicable misfortune. Some folklore intersected with survival skills. Certain snow patterns were read as omens for the coming year's harvest. Ice thickness, frost direction, and even bird behavior were interpreted to plan sowing, planting, and animal care. Practical observation merged seamlessly with superstition. No clear line separated science from myth. Royal courts, despite opulence, also embraced winter ritual and symbolism. Processions, feasts, and dances often incorporated seasonal motifs. Kings and queens might wear icy blue robes, display holly and mistletoe, or commission performances that dramatized winter struggle and triumph. Even in luxury, the cold was acknowledged. sometimes with ceremony, sometimes with subtle irony. Candlelight and fire became central symbols. Lighting candles at dusk was both practical and spiritual. Hearths were focal points for warmth, conversation, and ritual. Families gathered around flames, telling stories, singing, and performing small customs to mark time and create a sense of safety. Magic in winter extended to agriculture and livestock. Farmers might bless animals, sprinkle protective herbs in stables, or chant over seeds to ensure survival through frost. Even if the rituals had no measurable effect, they reinforced habits that increased survival, feeding animals, covering crops, and checking supplies. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals also adapted to winter conditions. Ceremonies were smaller, practical, and often indoors. Fires were central. Songs and prayers provided warmth of both body and spirit. Superstition lingered. Certain dates were considered unlucky in winter, and unusual weather could be interpreted as divine commentary. Winter festivals often involved a balance of indulgence and austerity. Feasts were enjoyed, but scarcity remained visible. Alcohol, usually beer or mead, provided warmth and social cohesion. Baked goods, dried fruits, and salted meats were shared sparingly. Communal gatherings were as much about survival as celebration. Stories and myths served a practical purpose. Ghosts reminded people to respect property and family. Frost demons encouraged caution outdoors. Miraculous tales of saints surviving ice, snow, or starvation reinforced faith and resilience. Even humor found its place. Tales of foolish travelers slipping on ice, frozen cows, or misjudged sleigh rides circulated quietly, bringing levity to an otherwise grim season. Winter shaped culture as much as it shaped bodies. The long, dark months demanded rituals, storytelling, superstition, and celebration to maintain sanity. It created traditions that endured: solstice festivals, feast days, protective charms, and practical knowledge. The cold was never entirely conquered, only managed. Survival required community, preparation, and ingenuity. Magic and myth helped people cope, offering narrative structure and psychological relief. And through all of it, humans found ways to celebrate small victories, comfort one another, and maintain hope despite frost and darkness. Winter festivals and folklore were therefore a quiet testament to endurance. Through ritual, storytelling, and shared experience, people navigated months of scarcity, danger, and cold. The season was harsh, yet it inspired creativity, faith, and cohesion. Even in a world without central heating, electricity, or modern medicine, humans persisted. They learned, adapted, and sometimes laughed softly at the absurdity of frost-covered life. Winter left its mark on bodies, homes, stories, and culture alike. Chapter 9: Soldiers and Winter, Frost, Fatigue, and Frozen Wars. Winter was an uninvited general in every medieval campaign. Armies did not pause because the ground was frozen, rivers iced over, or snow obscured paths. Instead, frost, fatigue, and logistics often decided the outcomes of battles before swords or arrows ever came into play. Soldiers, already hardy from routine drills and harsh training, faced additional challenges. Cold seeped through chainmail, leather boots, and wool tunics. Feet froze inside stiff boots. Hands turned blue while gripping weapons. Exposure was relentless, and even minor frostbite could render a soldier useless. Some chroniclers mention knights losing fingers or toes simply from standing guard on icy ramparts. It was not heroic, it was slow, quiet attrition. Armies needed constant supply. Winter made this nearly impossible. Roads became mud tracks, snow-laden plains, or rivers frozen only partially, all hazardous. Food had to travel from towns or rural holdings, often in sleds or wagons. Fires were essential for cooking, but smoke gave away positions and fueled complaints about smoke-filled camps. Rations were meager. Salted meat, hard bread, and sometimes cheese sustained troops. Water froze in buckets and barrels, forcing soldiers to melt ice or drink from streams. Every meal was a negotiation with frost. Sieges during winter were particularly grim. Castles could be stormed in summer, but in winter, the cold became a weapon. Defenders shivered in stone walls, sometimes lacking firewood. Attackers trudged through snow, ice cracking under the weight of armor and siege engines. Frozen moats could both help and hinder. They allowed attackers to cross, but heavy ice could break under carts or horses. Both sides risked hypothermia, injury, and illness, sometimes more dangerous than any arrow. Frost was an invisible enemy. It crept into tents, under boots, and between layers of clothing. Soldiers slept in straw bedding, sometimes wet from melted snow. Coughing, fever, and frostbite spread quietly, reducing numbers before any engagement. Chronicles note that more men often died from exposure than from battle itself. The winter army was a fragile organism, vulnerable to its environment as much as to the enemy. Morale was a constant concern. Long nights, monotonous drudgery, and relentless cold weighed on minds. Humor, storytelling, and small comforts, extra firewood, a hot drink, or a smuggled piece of cheese, became vital. Leaders who ignored winter's psychological impact often saw mutiny or desertion. Winter campaigns required inventive solutions. Marching orders were adjusted for daylight, roads were cleared, and sleds replaced wagons where possible. Soldiers improvised, boots stuffed with straw, woolen wraps around armor, and fires hidden from enemy view. Ingenuity often determined survival more than strategy. Consider the famous campaigns of Henry V in France. His troops faced freezing rivers, muddy roads, and icy fortresses. Yet meticulous planning, rationing, and leadership allowed them to persevere. Still, chroniclers mention frostbitten soldiers limping, abandoned horses, and spoiled supplies. Winter was both ally and enemy, shaping campaigns silently. Fortifications amplified the winter challenge. Castles, towers, and walled cities offered shelter, but stone was cold and firewood limited. Guards suffered long watches in the cold. Armories sometimes froze, making weapons brittle. Even the most prepared garrison was at risk of slow attrition. Naval operations were equally treacherous. Northern fleets faced frozen harbors, icy decks, and waves that seemed determined to freeze sailors in place. Ships grounded on ice, sails froze stiff, and men risked both frostbite and drowning. Yet commanders persisted. Winter could offer strategic advantage. Frozen rivers allowed unexpected crossings, snow-covered movements. But the price was high: exhaustion, illness, and slow, silent losses. Soldiers improvised clothing and bedding. Layers of wool, furs, and hides were common. Leather gloves and mittens were often patched repeatedly. Straw, hay, or moss-lined boots. Even so, frostbite was inevitable. Chroniclers sometimes describe entire companies rendered inactive by frozen extremities. Food scarcity magnified winter's toll. Siege or campaign supplies were difficult to store, transport, and preserve. Salted meat hardened like stone. Bread became stale and difficult to digest. Troops supplemented diets by hunting, scavenging, or occasionally looting, morally complicated but necessary. Winter battles were slower, quieter, and more methodical. Engagements were dictated as much by frozen terrain as by strategy. Cavalry struggled through snowdrifts. Infantry slogged through ice-covered fields. Missiles, arrows, and artillery were affected by frost and damp. Winter became a tactical factor, dictating movement, timing, and vulnerability. Soldiers' health deteriorated rapidly. Respiratory illnesses were rampant. Frostbite led to gangrene in some cases. Sleep deprivation, constant exposure, and hunger compounded these problems. Chroniclers note that regiments sometimes arrived at the battlefield more diminished by winter than by previous skirmishes. Winter campaigns also created unexpected opportunities. Frozen rivers allowed crossing points impossible in summer. Snow-covered terrain masked movement. Surprise attacks, quick raids, and sudden retreats became possible if soldiers could survive long enough to execute them. Fires, candles, and heated tents were tactical tools. They provided warmth, visibility, and morale, but drew attention. Commanders balanced comfort against risk. Every log burned was a strategic choice. Even with careful planning, losses were inevitable. Chroniclers from England, France, and Scandinavia all remark on winter attrition. Men died quietly in the snow, horses froze to death, and supplies spoiled. The cold was impartial. It favored no army, no king, no general. Yet winter campaigns shaped history. Decisions, victories, and defeats were influenced by frost, ice, and exhaustion. Winter forced adaptation, ingenuity, and patience. Success depended on logistics, morale, and endurance as much as tactical brilliance. By spring, survivors emerged hardened, wary, and surprisingly resilient. Those who endured frost, hunger, and fatigue often remembered winter as both enemy and teacher. Campaigns left scars, lessons, and stories, tales of quiet endurance as much as battlefield heroics. Winter in the medieval military world was therefore a slow, patient opponent. It punished carelessness, rewarded preparation, and shaped the fate of armies in subtle, relentless ways. Every frostbitten foot, frozen hand, and icy march contributed to history quietly but decisively. Chapter 10. Monks, scholars, and winter, cold, candlelight, and contemplation. While peasants froze in huts, nobles shivered in halls, and soldiers slogged through snow, monasteries and scholarly institutions offered a different winter challenge: endurance of the mind and spirit in freezing stone buildings. Monks were, in some ways, insulated from the worst of winter. They had routine, community, and purpose. But insulation was relative. Stone walls were cold. Wooden floors were icy. Fires were carefully rationed. Luxury did not exist. Warmth was a tool, not a comfort. Sleeping arrangements were austere. Dormitories were large, drafty halls. Straw mats or simple pallets served as bedding. Monks layered themselves with woolen robes, but warmth was minimal. Daily routines continued regardless of frost or snow. Prayer, study, and labor were structured and inflexible. Matins at dawn, which could be around 4 a.m., meant rising in near darkness, often before the fire could warm the hall. Feet cold, hands stiff, monks shuffled to the chapel, murmuring prayers and occasionally wincing at frostbite in extremities. Scriptoria, the rooms where manuscripts were copied, were a particular challenge. Scribes hunched over parchment with quills in freezing hands. Ink thickened in the cold, and vellum became stubbornly rigid. Candlelight provided the only illumination, flickering and insufficient, yet work continued. Illness was common. Respiratory infections thrived in cold, damp, and smoky interiors. Monks disciplined diets, mostly bread, porridge, and small portions of vegetables, kept them alive but did little for resistance to frost. Scholarship required both patience and adaptation. Copying texts, studying theology, or observing astronomical phenomena demanded precision. Cold made fine motor skills challenging. Fingers stiffened. Mistakes in transcription could propagate errors for generations. Yet dedication persisted. Every page copied, every calculation recorded, was a quiet triumph over winter's chill. Heating methods were minimal. Some monasteries had small fireplaces, but many relied on braziers or carefully managed hearths. Firewood was precious, rationed, and often damp. Smoke added discomfort, but warmth was worth it. Candlelight was fragile, expensive, and vital. Candles, tallow, or oil lamps illuminated manuscripts and prayer halls. Even small drafts could extinguish a flame, leaving scribes or monks in darkness, struggling to continue work. Candlelight required both patience and constant attention, and a quiet, steady hand. Winter labor was unavoidable. Monks chopped firewood, carried water from frozen wells, and maintained buildings while continuing their spiritual duties. The cold amplified every physical task. Even simple chores, sweeping, cooking, or tending animals, became slow, deliberate, and exhausting. Food scarcity was a recurring challenge. Winter stores had to last months. Grain, salted fish, legumes, and preserved vegetables formed the diet. Fasting rules compounded hardship, particularly during long religious observances. Hunger and cold together created a pervasive fatigue that monks endured with quiet stoicism. Scholars outside monasteries faced similar trials. Universities in Northern Europe had drafty lecture halls, minimal heating, and unpredictable supplies. Students copied texts, debated philosophy, and practiced logic in near-freezing classrooms. Frosty quills, stiff hands, and cold parchment were constant obstacles. Illness thrived in these environments. Crowded halls, insufficient nutrition, and exposure to cold led to fevers, coughs, and prolonged weakness. Even clerics and scholars, often considered privileged, were not immune. Chroniclers note outbreaks of respiratory disease, exacerbated by winter conditions. Yet winter also offered contemplative advantages. The long nights provided extended time for reflection, prayer, and study. Isolation encouraged focus. The starkness of frozen landscapes mirrored the introspective work within stone walls. Monks developed subtle strategies to cope. Warm furs or extra layers for writing sessions, shared blankets during study, and careful rotation of tasks to preserve body heat. Candlelight hours were optimized for productivity. Every adaptation reflected patience, ingenuity, and quiet endurance. Winter rituals in monasteries reinforced resilience. Communal prayers, chanting, and daily schedules offered structure amid the monotony of frost. Meditation, study, and manual labor became intertwined, fostering both spiritual and physical perseverance. Even humor appeared in subtle forms. Monks wrote marginalia, little drawings, jokes, or sarcastic notes to lighten the monotony. Frozen fingers, cold floors, and tedious copying all found expression in quiet, clever commentary in margins. Winter also shaped intellectual culture. Observations of the natural world, frost patterns, river freezing, snowfall, were recorded for practical and scholarly purposes. Calendars, astronomical tables, and agricultural notes all reflected an intimate awareness of seasonal realities. Knowledge was not abstract. It was forged under candlelight, frost, and constant vigilance. Community was essential. Shared labor, collective prayers, and cooperative coping with cold reinforced bonds. Monks learned from each other, who could start fires best, who managed wood stores efficiently, who was resilient under frost. Mutual support allowed survival in ways solitary effort could not. Even when illness or injury struck, monasteries offered relative care. Isolation, warm bedding near the hearth, and herbal remedies helped the weak endure. Death was present, inevitable, and acknowledged, but daily structure and ritual provided solace. By spring, monks and scholars emerged hardened, disciplined, and remarkably resilient. The cold, the hunger, and the monotony had shaped both body and mind. Every copied manuscript, observed celestial event, and survived frostbite was a testament to quiet endurance. Winter in religious and scholarly life was therefore a slow, contemplative teacher. It demanded patience, ingenuity, and persistence. It shaped culture, preserved knowledge, and instilled resilience in those dedicated to thought, prayer, and observation. Even without modern comfort, monks and scholars persisted. Candlelight flickered over frozen floors, ink scratched across parchment, and prayer echoed through stone halls. Winter left its mark, subtle, persistent, and formative. The cold was a companion, a challenge, and a silent shaper of intellectual life. Survival in winter required both discipline and humility. And in that quiet endurance, humanity preserved both knowledge and spirit, preparing for the thaw that would inevitably follow. Chapter 11. Winter illnesses, plague, pneumonia, and the perils of frost. Winter in the Dark Ages was never just cold, it was an incubator for illness. Disease thrived in frost, damp, and darkness, and every layer of clothing, every hearth, every ration was a fragile defense. Respiratory illnesses were the most persistent threat. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and influenza swept quietly through villages, towns, and castles alike. Cold air, poorly insulated living quarters, and drafty halls made survival difficult. Even minimal exposure could lead to infection, and once it began, treatment was mostly limited to warmth, rest, and prayer. Frostbite and hypothermia were slow killers. Hands, feet, ears, and noses were particularly vulnerable. Peasants often worked outdoors, tending livestock or collecting firewood, leaving extremities exposed. Nobles, despite furs and heated chambers, were not immune. Icy corridors, sleigh rides, and hunting trips created constant risk. Chroniclers occasionally note deaths from exposure, recorded with almost clinical brevity. He succumbed to the cold. No ceremony, no drama, just the frost claiming another life quietly. Malnutrition and scarcity compounded disease. Winter stores were limited, and poor harvests or failed hunting could mean months of inadequate nutrition. A weakened body struggled to fight even minor infections. Children and the elderly were disproportionately affected, and mortality often spiked during harsh winters. Famine and illness were intertwined. Villages isolated by snow or storms could exhaust food reserves quickly. Starvation lowered resistance, while infections spread easily in crowded or poorly heated homes. Even monasteries and castles were vulnerable if supply lines failed. Plague, though episodic, could strike in winter as well. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for Black Death outbreaks, persisted in rodent populations, fleas, and even contaminated food. Cold slowed its spread in some cases but did not prevent outbreaks entirely. When plague coincided with winter, communities suffered compounded hardships: frost, scarcity, and high mortality. Smallpox and measles were also winter hazards. Cold, damp conditions weakened immune defenses, and cramped living spaces facilitated transmission. Children often succumbed first, with families mourning quietly and continuing daily survival simultaneously. Hospital care, where it existed, was minimal. Monastic infirmaries or charitable institutions provided warmth, food, and basic attention, but sophisticated medicine was absent. Bloodletting, herbal poultices, and prayers were standard treatment. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it didn't. Winter accidents also contributed to mortality. Slips on ice, falls from ladders or roofs, and fires caused by hurried heating were frequent. Even minor injuries could become fatal if infection set in. Cold slowed healing, and wound care was primitive. Chroniclers often understated suffering. Death records might simply note, "He passed in winter," masking weeks of fever, coughing, or frostbite. Medical understanding was limited, so causes were often described in terms of imbalance: cold humors, divine punishment, or miasma. Isolation increased risk. Villagers or nobles confined to a single room for warmth faced stagnant air, spreading respiratory disease. Fires provided warmth but not ventilation. Sleeping arrangements with multiple family members or retainers amplified exposure to illness. Alcohol and hot beverages were used as preventive measures. Ale, mead, and mulled wine were consumed for warmth, comfort, and, some believed, protection against disease. While they did not prevent illness, they did improve morale, a critical factor in survival. Winter sickness shaped daily life. Work slowed during severe cold, particularly for those already weakened. Children missed tasks or schooling. Elders were often confined to bed. Even temporary respite from labor could mean the difference between survival and succumbing to disease. Hospitals and monastic infirmaries also struggled with supply. Herbs, clean water, and firewood were limited. Caregivers risked exposure themselves, often falling ill in the process. Despite dedication, winter illness could overwhelm even the most organized institutions. The psychological toll was subtle but pervasive. Fear of frostbite, fever, or plague influenced behavior. Communities developed coping mechanisms, communal fires, layering clothing, and early recognition of sickness. Rituals, prayers, and charms reinforced mental resilience, even if they did not cure disease. Mortality statistics were stark but rarely detailed. In some villages, up to a quarter of the population could die during prolonged harsh winters. Among the elite, records focused on lineage continuity rather than individual suffering. Still, frost, disease, and scarcity affected all levels of society, leaving no one untouched. Survivors often bore lasting effects. Chronic illness, weakened bodies, and frost-bitten extremities persisted long after winter ended. Even recovered soldiers, nobles, and peasants carried reminders of frost, hunger, and illness. Medical knowledge slowly evolved. Herbal remedies, isolation practices, and improved nutrition incrementally reduced vulnerability. Yet in the Dark Ages, winter was always an adversary, and illness its most silent weapon. Winter sickness intertwined with human resilience. Families, communities, and institutions learned to anticipate scarcity, manage frost, and mitigate disease. Practical strategies, layering clothing, rationing food, maintaining hygiene, and rotating labor, complemented ritual and superstition. Through vigilance, adaptation, and sheer endurance, people survived. But winter remained an impartial and persistent threat, quietly claiming lives and shaping human history in ways far more subtle than battle or conquest. Chapter 12. The Role of Fire and Fuel, Hearths, Chimneys, and the Economics of Warmth. In the Dark Ages, warmth was not guaranteed, it was earned, traded, and carefully rationed. Fire was both a comfort and a lifeline, shaping survival, social dynamics, and even architecture. Hearths were central to daily life. In castles, monasteries, and peasant cottages alike, the hearth provided cooking, warmth, and a gathering point. In large halls, a massive fireplace might warm a small section, leaving the edges cold and drafty. Stone floors stored chill, and heavy tapestries absorbed some warmth, but only a little. Chimneys, surprisingly, were still a luxury in many regions. Early medieval buildings often lacked vertical flues. Smoke exited through holes in the roof or gaps in walls. This allowed warmth to escape, filled rooms with soot, and required constant vigilance to maintain a fire without suffocating occupants. Fuel was precious. Wood was the primary source for most, though peat, coal, and dung were sometimes used depending on location. Forests were communal resources in rural areas. In cities, timber was expensive and often rationed. Even wealthy households monitored consumption carefully, as every log burned was both warmth and cost. The economics of fuel shaped winter behavior. Poor families might use damp wood, rush to gather fallen branches, or burn whatever was available, including scraps of furniture or straw. Monasteries managed stores meticulously, distributing firewood according to need, status, and available supply. Inefficient fires wasted both warmth and resources, a costly mistake in months of relentless cold. Hearths were social centers. Family and community life revolved around fire. Meals were cooked, stories were told, and laborers warmed themselves before continuing chores. In inns and taverns, communal fires offered temporary refuge for travelers and workers. Maintaining fire required constant attention. Logs were replenished regularly. Ashes were cleared. Sparks were monitored to prevent accidental blazes. In castles, servants rotated shifts to ensure warmth for both nobility and the hearth itself. Even a small lapse could leave rooms freezing in minutes. Heating methods varied. Portable braziers supplemented fixed fireplaces. Fires might be placed near beds or benches for targeted warmth. In some cases, stone or brick heat benches absorbed warmth from the hearth and radiated it slowly. These solutions were clever but limited. Large halls, long corridors, and stone floors remained icy despite best efforts. Fuel scarcity forced adaptations. Families layered clothing, slept huddled together, and adjusted daily routines to coincide with daylight and peak warmth. Cooking was scheduled efficiently, meals prepared when fire was available, dishes shared quickly before embers died. Every action was intertwined with fire management. Chimneys and ventilation also impacted survival. A poorly ventilated room could become smoky, exacerbating respiratory illness. A well-constructed chimney conserved heat, removed smoke, and allowed larger fires. Architectural innovations gradually improved warmth, but change was slow. Fuel economics also reinforced social hierarchy. Wealthy households could afford constant fire, thick furs, and multiple hearths. Poor families endured intermittent warmth, often rationing logs to only the most critical areas, kitchens or sleeping spaces. Shared fires in villages became centers for gossip, trade, and informal governance. Urban households often faced logistical challenges. Dense building clusters required careful fire management to prevent conflagrations. Wood deliveries were costly and labor-intensive. In winter, scarcity could mean choosing between warmth, cooking, or trade. Winter in monasteries highlighted fire's importance. Fires were lit in kitchens, infirmaries, and sometimes scriptoriums. Heat was shared strategically. Not everyone could be close to flames at once. Rotation and discipline ensured survival and productivity. Beyond survival, fire had symbolic significance. Hearths represented life, community, and continuity during harsh winters. Feasts, prayers, and rituals often centered around fire, both literally and metaphorically. Candles and braziers extended this principle to private devotion and scholarly work. Fuel shortages could be deadly. Poorly planned winters led to illness, frostbite, and even death. Communities developed resource-sharing systems, communal woodpiles, and early rationing practices to prevent catastrophe. Fire also dictated seasonal labor. Gathering wood, cutting peat, or collecting dung required planning, endurance, and coordination. Survival depended on preparation months in advance. Failure to stockpile adequately meant suffering, improvisation, and heightened mortality risk. Even the nobility had vulnerabilities. Storms could prevent timber transport. Snow could block access to supply forests. Servants could be overworked or delayed. Castles might be left partially cold, and ceremonial functions were occasionally constrained by the chill. In rural areas, reliance on fire was absolute. Stone cottages, thatched roofs, and small hearths required careful layering of warmth. Even a small lapse, an ember extinguished, a log damp, or a wind tunnel through a door, could have serious consequences. People adapted with blankets, animal skins, and coordinated indoor activity near the hearth. Fuel shaped daily rhythms. Cooking, laundry, crafting, and rest were synchronized with fire availability. Heat dictated productivity and social interaction. Winter survival was therefore a delicate balance of energy, labor, and planning. Hearths, chimneys, and fuel management were quiet determinants of life, shaping mortality, comfort, and social structures. The cold remained unyielding, but fire offered agency, hope, and control, a limited but essential victory over winter's relentlessness. Even centuries later, historians note the subtle interplay of fuel, architecture, and survival. Fire was not just warmth. It was a lifeline, a social anchor, and a measure of resourcefulness. In the Dark Ages, the humble log was as critical as the sword, the coin, or the law. Chapter 13: Children and Winter, Play, Peril, and Survival. Winter in the Dark Ages was difficult for everyone, but for children, it was a uniquely challenging season. Their small bodies were more vulnerable to frostbite, illness, and malnutrition, yet they still had to participate in daily labor, survive in harsh homes, and somehow find moments of play. Childhood was largely practical. From an early age, children were incorporated into the daily survival routines of family and community. They fetched firewood, carried water from frozen wells, tended animals, or helped with household chores. Tasks were often assigned according to strength and skill, small hands for delicate tasks, larger hands for heavy lifting. Frostbite was common. Children's extremities froze more easily than adults. Families wrapped little ones in layers of wool, linen, or even straw. Footwear was often improvised, patched repeatedly, and insufficient for prolonged exposure. Even indoor activity offered limited protection. Stone floors, drafty walls, and minimal heating left children shivering. Nutrition was critical and scarce. Winter diets were repetitive and limited: porridge, bread, salted meat, or dried vegetables. Children were often last to eat, receiving only scraps once adults and older siblings were fed. Malnutrition weakened resistance to disease, increasing vulnerability to cold and infection. Play persisted despite hardship. Snow offered opportunities for sledding, snowball fights, or simple games of chase. Imagination transformed frozen fields into forts, battlefields, or kingdoms. Play, while brief, served psychological as well as physical needs: relief, bonding, and skill development. Clothing constrained activity. Multiple layers, patched garments, and stiff footwear made running, climbing, or climbing difficult. Yet children adapted. Movement became deliberate but inventive. Snow and ice were both hazard and playground. Winter illness affected children disproportionately. Pneumonia, smallpox, measles, and dysentery could strike quickly. Families relied on rudimentary remedies: herbal infusions, poultices, and warm beds. Monastic infirmaries occasionally provided aid, but access was limited. Mortality rates were tragically high during prolonged, harsh winters. Education, when available, also continued in winter. Monastic schools, urban tutors, or wealthy households encouraged reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. Cold conditions made study challenging. Quills stiffened, parchment resisted ink, and candlelight flickered. Yet some children persevered, learning amidst frost and discomfort. Safety hazards were everywhere. Frozen rivers, slippery roads, and icy roofs presented constant danger. Children were instructed in caution, but accidents were inevitable. Chroniclers occasionally note fatalities from slips, falls, or exposure, recorded matter-of-factly: the boy fell on ice and did not recover. Community networks provided some protection. Neighbors looked after each other's children while parents worked. Village children often formed informal groups, sharing firewood, assisting in chores, and finding mutual warmth. Solidarity mitigated the harshness, though never eliminated risk. Winter also shaped socialization. Festivals, feast days, and church gatherings allowed children to interact beyond survival tasks. Storytelling, songs, and simple games reinforced culture, moral lessons, and resilience. Even brief moments of lightheartedness contributed to psychological endurance. Work and survival dominated daily life. Children were expected to contribute meaningfully, sometimes at the expense of comfort or play. Yet play emerged wherever possible, often cleverly disguised as productive activity: throwing snowballs while clearing the yard, sliding on ice while transporting goods, or sledding while delivering small packages. Clothing and bedding remained central to survival. Layering, sharing blankets, and huddling together were critical strategies. Parents monitored children constantly, adjusting garments and supplementing warmth with fire proximity. Sleeping arrangements were often communal, siblings huddled together or with parents for shared warmth. Mental resilience was fostered quietly. Observation, adaptation, and ingenuity were part of daily life. Children learned early to assess risk: which roads to traverse, how to protect extremities, when to remain near hearths. This subtle education ensured survival and cultivated patience, resourcefulness, and endurance. Winter mortality influenced family structures. High rates of childhood death shaped parenting, expectations, and community ties. Families developed rituals, protective measures, and coping strategies to navigate repeated losses quietly and persistently. Yet even in adversity, children found joy. Snow transformed landscapes into temporary wonderlands. Ice offered both play and transportation. Communal games, storytelling, and religious festivals provided moments of relief, laughter, and imagination. Children's experiences during winter reflected broader societal dynamics. They witnessed scarcity, labor, illness, and adaptation firsthand. Yet they also embodied resilience, inventiveness, and subtle rebellion against monotony. Winter in the Dark Ages for children was a balance of survival and fleeting pleasure. Every chore, every play session, every shared fire or blanket taught lessons in endurance. The frost was a constant adversary, but childhood persisted, inventive, cautious, and surprisingly resilient. Survival required preparation, cooperation, and observation. Children, despite their vulnerability, adapted to the cold, learned from adults, and found small ways to experience joy. Even brief moments of warmth, laughter, or play became vital in the relentless monotony of frost and darkness. Winter shaped bodies, minds, and culture alike. Children emerged from each season hardened, cautious, and quietly resourceful. The lessons of frost, scarcity, and ingenuity endured, preparing them for adulthood in a world where winter demanded vigilance, patience, and resilience. Chapter 14. The Psychological Toll: Isolation, Darkness, and the Slow Burn of Winter. Winter in the Dark Ages wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a mental one. Long nights, scarce sunlight, and monotonous routines exerted a subtle but persistent pressure on everyone: peasants, nobles, soldiers, and scholars alike. Darkness dominated. Sunlight was limited, and daylight hours shortened drastically. This affected daily routines, mood, and even perception of time. People woke late, worked briefly in the dim, and returned to dark, cold interiors, often before completing daily chores. The rhythm of life slowed, weighed down by frost, ice, and gloom. Isolation compounded the effect. Snow blocked roads, rivers, and paths, limiting social contact. Villages became pockets of activity surrounded by white stillness. Even within communities, people retreated indoors to conserve warmth, leaving many to face winter in quiet solitude. Monotony was relentless. Repetitive tasks, long watches, or sedentary study in freezing halls contributed to mental fatigue. For peasants, repetitive labor in frost and mud dulled perception. For nobles, idle hours could breed restlessness, boredom, or low-level anxiety. Sleep patterns were affected. Darkness encouraged long nights in theory, but in practice, cold, hunger, and worry disrupted rest. Monks adhered to strict schedules, but discomfort made sleep fitful. Soldiers and travelers often slept in shifts near fires or in drafty shelters, making proper rest scarce. Depression and anxiety were probably common, though unrecorded as we define them today. Chroniclers rarely described mental states in detail. Instead, subtle notes mention lethargy, irritability, or melancholy, often attributed to humors or divine will. Still, the signs are evident. Isolation, monotony, cold, and hunger took a psychological toll. Community interactions helped mitigate mental strain. Shared labor, communal fires, and festivals provided social contact. Stories, music, and rituals gave structure, purpose, and distraction. Even brief human contact offered relief from the relentless sameness of winter. Religion played a dual role. Prayers and rituals provided psychological comfort. Monks chanting in frozen halls, villagers lighting candles at dusk, and nobles observing feast days created a sense of continuity and order. Faith offered solace, a mental anchor amid frost and scarcity. Humor, subtle as it was, also persisted. Jokes, marginalia, and whispered comments helped relieve tension. Even small, quiet laughter in a frozen hall could provide relief and humanize the harsh environment. Winter fatigue affected performance and decision-making. Farmers misjudged planting or harvesting due to mental exhaustion. Soldiers made mistakes on icy roads or during marches. Nobles delayed administrative duties, sometimes worsening local crises. The mind, like the body, required adaptation to cold and monotony. Stories, myths, and superstitions served practical and psychological purposes. Fear of frost demons or wandering spirits reinforced caution, but also provided distraction. Tales of miraculous survival or saintly intervention offered hope amid despair. Even subtle rituals, sprinkling salt, leaving fire embers, or chanting protective prayers, gave a sense of control over an unpredictable world. Children experienced winter's mental toll keenly. Long hours indoors, restricted movement, and repetitive chores led to boredom, frustration, and occasional mischief. Yet imagination thrived quietly, transforming frozen fields into playgrounds, snowdrifts into castles, and chores into games. Play became a coping mechanism as vital as clothing or food. Art, music, and storytelling provided further relief. Carved toys, simple instruments, and communal singing broke monotony. Even in austere conditions, humans sought beauty, laughter, and connection. Winter, despite its weight, fostered creative resilience. Isolation forced reflection. Monks contemplated scripture, scholars observed the heavens, and nobles considered lineage and inheritance. Even peasants found moments of introspection while tending animals or waiting for firewood. The slow rhythm of frost and snow encouraged quiet thought, problem-solving, and adaptation. Mental resilience was cultivated through routine. Daily schedules, communal tasks, prayer, and ritual created predictable structures. Predictability provided comfort. Knowing when to rise, work, eat, pray, and rest mitigated the psychological strain of endless winter. Yet winter could exacerbate existing social tensions. Scarcity of food, fuel, and warmth heightened disputes. Families competed for limited resources. Villagers navigated both interpersonal and environmental stress, requiring diplomacy, patience, and compromise. Subtle adaptations persisted across society. Layered clothing, careful rationing, communal fires, and shared labor were not just physical survival strategies, they were mental tools. They offered predictability, security, and a sense of agency in a season defined by limitations. Winter shaped both body and mind in equal measure. The cold demanded endurance, the darkness demanded patience, and monotony demanded creativity. Survival was not only physical, it required subtle psychological strategies, community cooperation, and ritualized behavior. By spring, survivors emerged mentally fortified. They had endured monotony, isolation, and scarcity. They had adapted their routines, discovered coping mechanisms, and learned resilience through repetition and reflection. Winter left an imprint on culture and mentality. Stories, rituals, and customs preserved the lessons of endurance. Even subtle humor, quiet observation, and small acts of creativity were recorded indirectly in chronicles, marginalia, and oral traditions. The psychological toll of winter was slow, quiet, and relentless. It shaped decisions, behaviors, and survival strategies. It influenced daily life as much as frostbite, hunger, or disease. And through endurance, adaptation, and subtle ingenuity, humans persisted, mentally, physically, and culturally, until the thaw arrived. Chapter 15: Animals in Winter, Livestock, Pets, and Survival Strategies. Winter in the Dark Ages was challenging not just for humans, but for animals as well. Survival depended on careful management of livestock, ingenuity in protecting working animals, and adaptation to frozen landscapes. Livestock were essential. Cows, sheep, pigs, goats, and chickens provided food, clothing, and labor. Winter threatened these resources. Frozen pastures, limited fodder, and exposure to cold demanded constant attention. Farmers planned ahead. Hay, straw, and stored grains were collected during autumn to feed animals when fields froze. Shelters were constructed to provide windbreaks and protection from snow. Even so, livestock suffered. Frostbite, malnutrition, and disease were common. Water was a particular challenge. Frozen ponds, rivers, and wells meant that livestock needed alternative sources. Buckets of melted snow or streams accessible through holes in ice were carefully managed. Animals competed for these limited resources, and humans had to supervise constantly to prevent casualties. Working animals required special care. Horses, oxen, and donkeys were critical for transport, plowing, and hauling firewood. Cold, exhaustion, and ice created dangers for both animals and handlers. Blankets, straw bedding, and controlled rest periods were essential, sometimes barely sufficient. Illness and injury were common. Hooves could crack on ice. Frostbite affected ears and tails, and starvation weakened resistance to disease. Livestock mortality spiked in harsh winters, creating economic and food security pressures. Even wealthy households faced losses, though they could often absorb them more easily. Pets were present, though less documented. Dogs, cats, and sometimes birds provided companionship, protection, and pest control. Cats kept mice from stored grain, while dogs guarded property and assisted hunters. Pet survival depended on the same limited resources: warmth, food, and shelter. Winter feeding strategies were inventive. Branches, dried leaves, and agricultural byproducts supplemented hay. Animals were rotated to ensure equal access to shelter and food. Even small interventions, layering straw, blocking drafts, or providing shared warmth, could prevent fatalities. Community cooperation often extended to livestock. Villagers shared barns, fodder, or labor to protect animals. Livestock lost to frost, disease, or scarcity affected entire communities, highlighting the interdependence of survival. Monastic farms provide some of the clearest records. Monks meticulously recorded fodder allocation, animal births, and winter deaths. Shelters were carefully maintained and labor organized to ensure minimal loss. Yet despite careful management, frost and scarcity claimed many animals quietly. Animals influenced human routines. Feeding schedules dictated work patterns. Fires were maintained near barns. Paths to water were cleared of snow. Even simple chores were dictated by the needs of animals, especially in extreme cold. Frozen landscapes created both hazards and opportunities. Icy fields slowed grazing but allowed sled transport. Snow could protect shallow root fodder but also obscure hazards. Herding required skill, endurance, and careful planning to prevent losses. Winter mortality had cascading effects. Lost animals meant reduced food, clothing, labor, and economic stability. Communities relied on foresight, preparation, and shared strategies to survive prolonged harsh periods. Human ingenuity extended to minor comforts for animals. Blankets, straw bedding, temporary shelters, and supplemental feeding reflected an early understanding of animal care. Even so, frost, disease, and scarcity often limited effectiveness. Animals also served psychological needs. Pets offered companionship. Horses and dogs were loyal labor partners. Their survival, warmth, and activity provided structure and routine amid human monotony. Winter work often centered on animals. Milking, feeding, cleaning stalls, and transporting fodder demanded endurance and coordination. Even brief absences could jeopardize animal health, underscoring the delicate balance of survival. The bond between humans and animals was reciprocal. Animals provided sustenance, labor, protection, and companionship. Humans provided shelter, care, and food, navigating scarcity, frost, and disease. Winter tested this relationship in relentless and often quiet ways. Adaptation was continuous. Farmers and herders learned to predict weather, store resources, and rotate animals. Losses were inevitable, but ingenuity, cooperation, and patience ensured overall survival. By spring, surviving animals reflected the success of winter strategies. Those that endured harsh months provided milk, labor, meat, and wool. Their survival enabled human communities to thrive, if only for another season. Winter shaped agricultural and social structures. Communities adapted routines, architecture, and labor to meet the dual challenge of frost and animal needs. Even the simplest daily tasks were influenced by the presence and vulnerability of livestock. Animals were silent participants in human winter survival. Their endurance mirrored human resilience, while losses underscored vulnerability. Together, humans and animals navigated months of cold, scarcity, and monotony, sustaining life against relentless frost. Chapter 16: Architecture and Winter. Homes, castles, and the battle against cold. Winter forced people to think about survival not just in terms of food or clothing, but also shelter. Architecture, from humble cottages to sprawling castles, was a critical factor in enduring frost, snow, and icy winds. Peasant homes were small, simple, and often inadequate for winter. Walls were made of wattle and daub, timber, or stone when available. Roofs were thatched, letting in drafts and sometimes snow. Floors were packed earth or rough stone, absorbing chill and making indoor warmth fleeting. Hearths were central to survival. In small cottages, a single fire provided both cooking and warmth. Smoke escaped through roof gaps or small openings, while the heat stayed unevenly distributed. Families huddled near the hearth, layering blankets, straw, and animal skins to preserve warmth. Windows were rare or covered with oiled cloth, thin glass, or wooden shutters. Daylight was limited in winter, and insulation was minimal. Stone or timber walls conducted cold, making even indoor life harsh. In extreme conditions, families might sleep fully clothed under layers of bedding near the fire. Castles faced different challenges. Large halls were drafty and difficult to heat. Stone walls absorbed and radiated cold slowly. Fireplaces were bigger, but still struggled to warm enormous rooms, high ceilings, and long corridors. Servants often maintained multiple hearths to provide comfort to nobility. Chimneys were a luxury that gradually spread over the period. Earlier designs allowed smoke to exit through roof holes, filling rooms with soot and smoke. Improved chimneys directed smoke upward while retaining more heat, but adoption was slow. Even in castles, cold corners and icy corridors were unavoidable. Fortifications added complexity. Thick stone walls, towers, and battlements were excellent for defense, but poor insulators against frost. Winter patrols, guard duties, and sentries exposed personnel to extreme cold. Heating was localized, a small hearth in the guardroom or tower, leaving much of the structure frigid. Monastic architecture reflects adaptation to winter. Cloisters, refectories, and dormitories were organized to maximize shared warmth. Fires were carefully managed, and sleeping arrangements rotated to ensure everyone had access to residual heat. Stone floors remained cold, but straw mats, tapestries, and shared proximity mitigated exposure. Urban houses faced density challenges. Closely packed timber-framed homes shared walls, reducing some heat loss. However, fire hazards and limited ventilation created constant tension. Residents balanced warmth, air quality, and safety daily. Insulation was rudimentary. Animal skins, wool blankets, straw, and rushes were used wherever possible. Tapestries served both decorative and functional purposes, lining walls to trap heat. Windows, when present, were small, limiting heat loss but also daylight penetration. Roof design impacted survival. Steeply pitched roofs allowed snow to slide off, reducing structural stress. Thatched or shingled roofs provided basic insulation, though leaks were common. Heavy snowfall could collapse inadequate structures, forcing improvisation or communal rebuilding. Winter lighting affected perception of space. Candlelight, torches, and hearths illuminated interiors, but shadows dominated corners. Darkness contributed to psychological strain, highlighting the importance of hearth-centered design and communal spaces. Water access shaped architecture too. Frozen wells, blocked channels, and snow-covered cisterns required careful planning. Courtyards, covered passages, and internal storage areas were designed to keep water accessible and prevent pipes or cisterns from freezing. Fire management shaped room layout. Kitchens were often separate or semi-detached to reduce fire hazard. Great halls prioritized airflow and congregation over warmth. Bedrooms, smaller and clustered, provided more consistent heat for sleeping. Adaptation was ongoing. People experimented with layering materials, creating windbreaks, and optimizing hearth placement. Even modest adjustments, moving beds closer to walls, raising platforms above cold floors, could improve comfort and survival. Winter forced societies to integrate architecture with daily life. Every design choice, wall thickness, roof pitch, hearth placement, window size, affected survival. Humans learned through trial, observation, and communal knowledge, gradually refining structures to meet the demands of frost and snow. By spring, surviving structures revealed the effectiveness of these strategies. Homes and castles that endured harsh months reflected careful planning, resource allocation, and adaptation. Even modest buildings demonstrated ingenuity in balancing warmth, ventilation, and fire safety. Winter architecture was a quiet battle against nature. It demanded forethought, labor, and community cooperation. The cold could not be eliminated, but humans could mitigate it through design, resourcefulness, and continuous adaptation. Buildings shaped winter life as much as food, clothing, or labor. They framed daily routines, protected health, and fostered social interaction. From peasants to nobles, winter survival was inseparable from architecture, a silent, omnipresent partner in the struggle against frost. Chapter 17, Clothing and Textiles, Wrapping Up Against the Cold. Winter in the Dark Ages was a season defined by layers, texture, and ingenuity. Clothing was not just decoration, it was survival, signaling status, and providing crucial protection against frost and dampness. Peasants wore practical garments. Wool, linen, and occasionally animal skins formed the core of winter attire. Multiple layers trapped heat, while dense fabrics resisted wind and moisture. Patching and mending were constant tasks. Clothing had to last through harsh months. Footwear was essential but often inadequate. Leather shoes or boots were common, sometimes stuffed with straw for insulation. Poor families improvised with cloth wrappings or layered foot coverings. Frozen ground, icy roads, and prolonged exposure made frostbite a constant risk. Gloves and mittens were uncommon for the poorest, but essential for warmth. Nobility enjoyed finer materials, thicker wool, and even fur linings. Peasants relied on layering, shared mittens among siblings, or stuffing hands into sleeves when working outdoors. Head coverings were critical. Hoods, coifs, and simple caps preserved warmth and prevented frostbite of ears and scalp. Even partial coverage improved survival. Drafts around the neck or head could sap body heat quickly. Layering was key. Undergarments, tunics, cloaks, and outer coats created insulation. Fabrics absorbed body heat while resisting wind and moisture. Layers were adjusted depending on activity. Labor-intensive chores required lighter configurations. Rest demanded full insulation. Nobility had access to luxury textiles. Furs, embroidered wool, and imported fabrics offered warmth and status simultaneously. Cloaks lined with ermine or squirrel fur were not just fashion statements. They were practical adaptations to bitter cold. Monastic clothing emphasized practicality and warmth. Simple woolen robes, hoods, and cloaks provided insulation while allowing movement. Layering was standard, particularly for outdoor labor, and habits helped conserve warmth during extended prayer or study. Children's clothing mirrored adult practices but scaled down. Multiple layers, patched garments, and hoods protected small bodies from frost. Clothing was often shared, handed down, or creatively improvised to maximize warmth and durability. Textile maintenance was constant. Wool needed cleaning, felting, and repair. Wet garments were dried near fires carefully, avoiding fire hazards. Clothing scarcity meant improvisation, layering rags, sewing scraps, and even repurposing old garments. Furs and pelts were valuable. They provided insulation in extreme cold. Peasants sometimes trapped animals for survival purposes. Nobility obtained pelts through trade or hunting. Even partial use, lining gloves, cloaks, or hats, improved warmth considerably. Cold and damp created hazards. Wet clothing could freeze, sap body heat, and increase mortality risk. People learned to dry garments efficiently, keep layers dry, and avoid prolonged exposure to snow or icy water. Accessories also mattered. Scarves, sashes, and belts kept warmth close to the body and prevented drafts. Hoods could be adjusted, cloaks wrapped tightly, and mittens layered. Every detail was a small adaptation to an unforgiving environment. Color and material had practical as well as social significance. Darker fabrics absorbed more heat. Lighter or finer fabrics signaled status but required careful layering for warmth. Even embroidery or ornamentation had subtle secondary effects. Denser stitching added insulation. Winter clothing shaped movement and daily life. Heavy cloaks, layered tunics, and insulated boots limited agility but ensured survival. Work, prayer, travel, and leisure were all adjusted to accommodate the weight and constraints of garments. The evolution of clothing reflected observation and adaptation. Layering, felting, weaving, and selective use of furs represented centuries of trial and error. Every stitch, patch, and layer was part of a quiet battle against frost. Human ingenuity extended to shared solutions. Families coordinated clothing, shared blankets, and huddled together for warmth. Even small improvisations, stuffing gloves, layering straw, or wrapping multiple tunics, made a significant difference. Clothing was survival, identity, and culture intertwined. It reflected social hierarchy, economic reality, and practical ingenuity. In winter, garments defined who could endure, who needed assistance, and who faced the harshest consequences of frost. By spring, surviving clothing bore the marks of winter. Patches, wear, and repair told stories of endurance. Yet through ingenuity, layering, and resourcefulness, humans continued to shield themselves from cold, preserving warmth, health, and functionality until the thaw. Winter attire was more than a necessity, it was a strategy. It shaped routines, dictated activity, and influenced survival. The fabrics, layers, and adaptations of the Dark Ages were silent but vital participants in humanity's struggle against frost, scarcity, and monotony. Chapter 18: Food and Winter Diets. Sustenance, Scarcity, and Survival. Winter in the Dark Ages was a season of scarcity as much as cold. The fields were barren, rivers partially frozen, and hunting often limited. Survival depended on stored provisions, careful planning, and inventive use of whatever food was available. Peasant diets were repetitive and modest. Grains formed the base: oats, barley, rye, and wheat when available. Bread, porridge, and gruel were staples, often flavored with whatever herbs or fat could be spared. Vegetables were limited to roots and preserved foods: onions, leeks, turnips, cabbages, and dried legumes. Meat was rare for commoners. Pigs, goats, and chickens might be slaughtered before winter, but fresh meat was scarce once stores dwindled. Salted or smoked meats supplemented the diet, though often unevenly distributed. Hunting, when possible, added variety, but snow and frost reduced access and game populations. Dairy played a critical role. Milk, cheese, and butter provided nutrition, fat, and calories essential for surviving cold. Even then, spoilage was a constant concern. Preservation required careful storage, often in cool but not freezing areas. Grain and flour were sometimes stored in communal granaries. Village cooperation ensured that resources lasted through prolonged winters. Yet poor harvests, theft, or mismanagement could quickly create scarcity, and food rationing became necessary. Monastic diets were often more reliable. Gardens, stored provisions, and careful planning ensured a more consistent food supply. Monks supplemented staples with preserved vegetables, dried fruits, legumes, and occasionally fish or poultry. Even so, harsh winters tested supply chains, forcing careful rationing and creativity. Nobility had greater access to variety. Game, fish, imported spices, and preserved delicacies enriched their tables. Winter feasts were still common, though they relied heavily on preserved foods, cold storage techniques, and stockpiled supplies. Even the wealthiest households faced planning challenges. Snow and ice could delay deliveries, strain kitchens, and spoil delicate ingredients. Preservation was essential. Salting, smoking, drying, pickling, and fermenting extended the shelf life of meat, fish, and vegetables. Cellars, cold storage pits, and insulated rooms slowed spoilage. Ineffective preservation could lead to illness or loss of critical resources. Roots and tubers were winter lifelines. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, and beets were hardy, storable, and calorie-dense. They were boiled, roasted, or incorporated into stews, often flavored minimally but providing essential nutrients. Legumes supplemented diets. Beans, peas, and lentils were preserved and consumed in soups, stews, and porridges. They provided protein and calories when meat was unavailable, helping maintain strength against cold and labor demands. Grains were sometimes ground at home, though communal mills were common. Flour was used for bread, porridge, or flat cakes, and rationing ensured it lasted through harsh months. Even minor miscalculations could create shortages, forcing reliance on alternative or less palatable foods. Fats were critical. Butter, lard, and rendered animal fats provided calories and warmth. Even small amounts improved survival, especially for children, the elderly, and laborers performing outdoor tasks. Beverages contributed both nutrition and warmth. Ale, weak beer, and mead were consumed daily, providing hydration, calories, and some antiseptic protection. Hot herbal infusions and broths offered comfort and maintained body heat. Food scarcity influenced behavior. Communities rationed carefully, coordinated communal meals, and prioritized vulnerable members. Children and the elderly were fed first when possible, though shortages sometimes made this impossible. Starvation, malnutrition, and illness were quiet but persistent companions of winter. Winter labor also shaped diets. Long hours tending livestock, gathering firewood, or preparing food demanded calories. Meals were scheduled to maximize energy, sustain productivity, and conserve limited fuel for cooking. The psychological role of food was significant. Even simple, warm meals provided comfort, structure, and morale. Communal eating reinforced social bonds, offered distraction from monotony, and reinforced routines critical for survival. Hunting and fishing supplemented diets when feasible. Frozen rivers limited access, but ice holes, snares, and winter hunts provided intermittent protein. Success depended on skill, patience, and sometimes luck. Failures highlighted dependence on stored provisions and careful planning. Famine was always a threat. Poor harvests, extended frost, and animal losses created cycles of scarcity. Communities developed early strategies for stockpiling, preservation, and rationing, though these were not always sufficient. Winter diets reinforced social hierarchies. Nobility maintained richer, more diverse tables. Peasants subsisted on basics, and shortages hit the poor first and hardest. Even small differences in resources could mean the difference between survival and illness. adaptation was continuous. Recipes, preservation methods, and meal timing evolved based on experience. Winter survival was a combination of planning, ingenuity, and communal cooperation. By spring, the surviving population reflected both skill and resilience. Those who endured winter diets, repetitive, sparse, yet calorically sufficient, emerged prepared for planting, labor, and continued survival. Food in the Dark Ages winter was more than sustenance. It was strategy, culture, and survival intertwined. From root vegetables to salted meats, preserved grains to communal stews, every bite carried weight, physical, social, and psychological. The season shaped not just bodies, but communities, routines, and human ingenuity. Chapter 19: Travel and Communication. Winter roads, snow, and isolation. Winter in the Dark Ages was a season of isolation not only because of cold, but because moving from place to place became a slow, arduous, and sometimes dangerous task. Frozen roads, snow-blocked paths, and limited daylight constrained travel for peasants, merchants, soldiers, and nobility alike. Rural roads were treacherous. Mud turned to ice, snow accumulated in drifts, and narrow paths became impassable. Foot travelers struggled, and wheeled transport was often impossible. Villagers relied on cleared paths, sleds, or simple snowshoes when conditions permitted. Sledges and sleds were critical innovations. Wooden runners allowed transport over snow, especially for firewood, food, and fodder. Peasants often coordinated communal sledding of supplies to ease labor. Even then, heavy loads or deep snow could stall progress, leaving people and animals exhausted. Horseback travel was risky. Frozen or icy terrain increased the chance of falls, injury, and loss of valuable animals. Horses required extra feed, water, and care in winter, making long journeys both expensive and arduous. Nobility traveling for political or ceremonial reasons faced unique logistical challenges in maintaining both animals and servants. Rivers were both barriers and highways. Frozen rivers slowed navigation, but ice sometimes provided temporary roads for sleds or foot traffic. Thawed or partially frozen rivers posed hazards. Falling through ice could be fatal. Bridges were scarce, and crossing frozen waters required caution, local knowledge, and sometimes brute force. Travel delays were common. Merchants, messengers, and pilgrims adjusted plans according to weather. Messages took longer to deliver, trade slowed, and communication between villages or regions was sporadic. Delays could impact food supply, political decisions, and even winter survival strategies. Urban centers faced congestion. Snow and ice slowed movement through narrow streets. Delivery of firewood, food, and trade goods depended on coordinated schedules and careful handling of transport animals. City dwellers often spent long hours indoors waiting for supplies to arrive safely. Military campaigns were rarely attempted in midwinter. Armies struggled with frozen terrain, food scarcity, and frost exposure. Even well-equipped soldiers faced injury, illness, and logistical nightmares. Winter offered natural defense. Fortifications could be reinforced, and frozen terrain discouraged enemy movement. Travel safety was community-dependent. Neighbors shared information about snowdrifts, icy patches, and blocked paths. Villagers sometimes traveled in groups for mutual protection, combining labor to clear roads or help carry loads. Isolation increased risk, while cooperation improved survival odds. Communication relied on both human and natural methods. Messengers traveled cautiously, relying on known paths, landmarks, and sometimes dogs or horses. Visual signals, bells, and smoke were used locally, though winter conditions limited their effectiveness. News moved slowly. Rumors and updates were often days, weeks, or even months delayed. Merchants adapted to winter by stockpiling goods. Trade routes were adjusted, goods consolidated, and local markets relied on stored provisions. Long-distance trade slowed dramatically, especially across snow-covered passes or frozen rivers. Winter scarcity meant prices rose, delays increased, and social hierarchies influenced access to critical goods. Travelers prepared carefully. Warm clothing, provisions, and layered footwear were essential. Even minor miscalculations, underestimated snow, delayed departure, or insufficient supplies could leave travelers stranded or frozen. Stories survive of people lost to snowstorms, frostbite, or illness during seemingly routine journeys. Winter isolation influenced social structures. Villages relied on local resources and communal networks. Letters, decrees, or messages from distant lords arrived slowly, if at all. Local governance, resource allocation, and emergency planning were essential to mitigate the risks of isolation. Religious and social obligations adapted to travel challenges. Pilgrimages, festivals, and ceremonies were scheduled with winter constraints in mind. Some events were postponed, shortened, or relocated to more accessible areas. Even nobility often accepted reduced attendance or delayed communication to accommodate the season. Winter travel also shaped psychology. The physical effort, monotony, and risk of frostbite, hunger, or injury required patience, resilience, and foresight. Journeys became deliberate and cautious, reinforcing human adaptation to seasonal limitations. Animals played a critical role in winter travel. Horses, oxen, and dogs provided transport, hauling capacity, and companionship. Animals required extra care, feeding, and protection, influencing travel speed, distance, and safety. By spring, travel resumed with less risk and greater efficiency. Roads cleared, rivers thawed, and daylight returned, allowing trade, communication, and social interaction to flourish once more. Winter had enforced patience, ingenuity, and reliance on community networks, shaping how humans moved and interacted. Winter travel and communication were slow, cautious, and often dangerous. Yet they also fostered resilience, cooperation, and inventive solutions to frozen landscapes. In the Dark Ages, survival depended not just on fire, food, or clothing, but also on the ability to navigate winter's isolation, physically, socially, and psychologically. Chapter 20: Entertainment and Rituals. Light and Life in the Long Nights. Winter in the Dark Ages was long, dark, and, frankly, a bit monotonous. Yet humans have a knack for creating diversion, ritual, and light in even the harshest conditions. Entertainment, storytelling, music, and seasonal rituals softened the monotony and provided mental and social relief. Storytelling was central. Families, neighbors, or monks gathered around fires to recount tales of saints, local heroes, or ancestral exploits. Stories ranged from moral lessons to fantastical adventures, providing amusement, guidance, and psychological comfort. Even repetitive or exaggerated stories reinforce tradition, social norms, and survival wisdom. Songs and music accompanied daily and seasonal life. Simple instruments, flutes, drums, lyres, or bells, broke the monotony of frost and labor. Communal singing during work, at feast days, or around hearths reinforced social bonds and rhythm in daily routines. Music was functional as well as recreational, pacing labor or marking ceremonial moments. Games and informal competitions offered relief. Children and adults engaged in snowball fights, sled races, or indoor games when weather restricted outdoor activity. Even the poorest households found ways to create entertainment from imagination, simple objects, or available materials. Play and competition provided both exercise and psychological diversion, subtly preparing children for future labor or social roles. Religious rituals structured life. Church services, feast days, and seasonal observances created a sense of continuity and order amid frost and darkness. Candles, incense, and ceremonial clothing added light, warmth, and texture to otherwise austere environments. Even monastic communities with strict schedules, allowed small moments of ritualistic reflection that alleviated monotony. Feast days punctuated winter. Celebrations like Christmas, Yule, or local saints' days provided communal gatherings, special foods, and social interaction. Even when scarcity persisted, these events fostered morale, reinforced cultural identity, and offered psychological relief. Crafts and handiwork occupied long nights. Weaving, embroidery, wood carving, and tool repair were not only practical but provided a creative outlet. These activities filled time, developed skills, and sometimes produced goods that could be traded or saved. Fairs and markets were limited in midwinter but adapted. When travel allowed, temporary gatherings offered trade, news, and social interaction. Ice, snow, and reduced visibility made attendance risky, yet communities valued these events for both material and social reasons. Firelight played a symbolic and practical role. Hearths were the center of warmth, cooking, and social gathering. Stories, music, games, and meals revolved around the fire, creating shared experiences that countered isolation and monotony. Humor persisted quietly. Jokes, playful teasing, and absurd stories were shared to lighten the oppressive gloom. Even dry, sarcastic, or understated humor offered psychological relief in a season dominated by cold and darkness. Nighttime work continued for some. Milking, animal care, and fire maintenance required attention even after dark. Entertainment often overlapped with duty. Communal chores could be accompanied by storytelling, singing, or playful banter, transforming labor into subtle diversion. Seasonal adaptations influenced entertainment. Frozen rivers allowed ice play or sleighing. Snow provided temporary arenas for sports, games, and competitions. Even harsh weather became a stage for creative engagement, social bonding, and skill development. Winter isolation emphasized the importance of shared experience. Community gatherings, religious observances, and family rituals mitigated the psychological weight of monotony and darkness. Even brief moments of light, warmth, and amusement strengthened social cohesion and individual resilience. Adults and children alike depended on structured activities. Tasks were interspersed with storytelling, music, or craft, providing rhythm and breaking monotony. The interplay of survival, labor, and entertainment was subtle but critical. Life could not pause entirely, even in harsh months. Psychological endurance was cultivated through ritualized time. Seasonal events, daily routines, and recurring ceremonies provided predictability. Predictable structures alleviated stress, reinforced social bonds, and subtly maintained morale. Entertainment in winter was functional and adaptive. It shaped social relationships, reinforced cultural knowledge, and supported mental health. Even minor distractions, a song, story, or craft, played a vital role in endurance, helping humans persist through frost, scarcity, and monotony. By spring, memories of winter entertainment reflected both resilience and cultural continuity. Stories, songs, and rituals persisted, passed from one generation to the next, preserving shared experience and practical wisdom. Even in harsh seasons, humans found ways to laugh quietly, create meaning, and maintain social bonds. Winter's long nights demanded adaptation, creativity, and communal engagement. Entertainment and ritual were not luxuries. They were essential tools for survival. Through stories, music, games, and shared celebration, humans navigated monotony, isolation, and darkness, emerging ready to face the thaw and the work of spring once more. Chapter 21: Health and Hygiene, Winter Illnesses, Remedies, and Resilience. Winter in the Dark Ages was not just cold, dark, and monotonous. It was also a time of illness and vulnerability. Frost, scarcity, crowded indoor spaces, and limited nutrition created a breeding ground for disease, fatigue, and subtle health crises. Hygiene was rudimentary. Bathing was infrequent, often limited by frozen water, fuel scarcity, or social custom. People relied on dry cleaning with cloth, brushing, and occasional cold or tepid washes. Even minor exposure to cold water could be uncomfortable or risky, making hygiene sporadic at best. Indoor spaces were crowded and drafty. Peasant cottages often housed entire families with livestock nearby, increasing exposure to parasites, odors, and germs. Stone and timber halls absorbed moisture, creating damp environments conducive to respiratory problems and skin ailments. Monasteries, castles, and urban homes faced similar challenges, though wealthier households could mitigate them with ventilation, fires, and cleaning routines. Respiratory illnesses were common. Coughs, colds, and fevers emerged frequently, often exacerbated by cold, damp conditions and limited diet. Children, the elderly, and laborers were most vulnerable. Preventative strategies included staying near fires, layering clothing, and avoiding unnecessary exposure to cold winds. Digestive ailments arose from diet, scarcity, and preservation issues. Spoiled food, improper storage, and limited variety led to occasional gastrointestinal distress. Simple remedies, herbal infusions, careful rationing, and sometimes fasting were used to alleviate symptoms. Monks and herbalists maintained knowledge of local plants with mild medicinal properties, though efficacy varied. Injuries were exacerbated by cold. Frostbitten fingers and toes, slips on ice, and accidents with firewood or sleds were common. Wounds healed slowly in freezing temperatures, and infections could easily worsen without antiseptics. Even minor cuts or burns were taken seriously, often treated with herbal poultices or layered cloth bandages. Mental health and physical health intertwined. Isolation, monotony, and the stress of scarcity contributed to fatigue, irritability, and low morale. Sleep disruption, hunger, and constant labor added to physiological stress, weakening resistance to disease. Communal support, routine, and small comforts, food, fire, companionship, played subtle but important roles in maintaining resilience. Children were particularly vulnerable. Cold, limited nutrition, and cramped living conditions increased susceptibility to illness. Parents improvised extra layers, shared bedding, and monitored activity to mitigate risks. Even then, winter mortality among infants and children remained high, quietly shaping population dynamics. Remedies were a mixture of observation, tradition, and superstition. Herbs like sage, thyme, and chamomile were used for minor fevers or digestive issues. Poultices, compresses, and simple surgical interventions were employed for injuries. Spiritual remedies, prayers, charms, or blessings supplemented practical treatment, reflecting the intertwined nature of medicine and belief. Dietary choices also supported health. Root vegetables, grains, dairy, and preserved meats provided calories and some vitamins, though deficiencies were common. Herbs, seasonal fruits, and occasional supplements offered limited nutritional variation. Maintaining strength was critical. Even small reductions in food intake or calorie density increased vulnerability to cold and illness. Communal practices mitigated risks. Villagers shared knowledge of remedies, quarantined sick individuals when possible, and coordinated care for vulnerable members. Monasteries often served as early medical centers, preserving knowledge and tending to the sick with structured routines and observation. Cold, darkness, and damp created subtle hazards. Hypothermia could develop slowly, often unnoticed until severe. Wet clothing, exposure to drafts, or fatigue increased susceptibility. Even minor miscalculations in layering, shelter, or rest could have serious consequences. Winter illness also shaped labor and routines. Sick individuals were removed from strenuous tasks. Healthy family members compensated. Communities adjusted schedules, postponed activities, and relied on redundancy to maintain essential labor, particularly in agriculture, animal care, and firewood collection. Sleep and rest were as much preventative as curative. Maintaining warmth during sleep, rotating shifts for chores, and huddling for shared body heat helped preserve energy and resistance to disease. Even minimal disruption of routine could compromise resilience, underscoring the delicate balance of survival. By spring, survivors reflected resilience and careful adaptation. Those who endured winter illnesses, managed minor injuries, and maintained hygiene, however rudimentary, emerged stronger for planting, labor, and community activity. Winter health strategies were quiet, subtle, and cumulative, small adjustments with significant long-term impact. Health and hygiene in winter were never glamorous. They required vigilance, routine, and adaptation to scarcity, cold, and isolation. Even minor improvements in warmth, diet, or cleanliness could tip the balance between survival and illness. Through ingenuity, observation, and communal effort, people quietly navigated winter's hazards, preserving life until the thaw.